The torches of empire, burning for over 1,000 years, flickered into darkness in 476 CE. In Ravenna's marble halls, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, strode toward a throne once commanded by Caesar Augustus himself. But waiting for him was no great conqueror, only Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor mocked even by his own court. At just 16, he would become the final symbol of a collapsing world. With a single act, the Western Roman Empire exhaled its last breath, and the ancient order gave way to the chaos of a new age. This is the story of Rome's twilight, the moment the eternal city ceased to be eternal. Odoacer, this barbarian king who had served Rome faithfully as a mercenary, gently removed the purple cloak from the boy's shoulders. He gathered the imperial regalia, the diadem, the scepter, the golden fibulae that had adorned emperors since Constantine, and sealed them in a chest. Then he did something unprecedented in Roman history. He sent them east to Constantinople with a message that the Western Empire no longer required an emperor. The gesture was almost courteous. There would be no execution, no public humiliation. Romulus Augustulus was pensioned off to a villa in Campania, where he would live out his days as a curious footnote to history. Yet, in that moment of imperial abdication, something far greater than a dynasty died. The ancient world itself was breathing its last. But here, in what historians would later call the fall of Rome, we must pause to understand what was really ending and what was about to begin. The Roman Empire had not collapsed suddenly, like a building struck by lightning. For over 2 centuries, it had been transforming, fragmenting, reconstituting itself in forms that would have seemed alien to Marcus Aurelius or even Constantine the Great. The empire that ended in 476 was already profoundly medieval in character. Its armies were largely Germanic, its administration increasingly decentralized, its culture thoroughly Christianized, its economy more agricultural than urban. The barbarians who inherited Roman authority were not savage destroyers, but sophisticated inheritors who had spent generations learning Roman ways, serving Roman masters, and dreaming Roman dreams. They did not seek to destroy Roman civilization. They sought to possess it, to legitimize themselves through it, to become its rightful heirs. Yet something irreplaceable was lost forever in 476, the idea of unity. For a millennium, despite civil wars and crises, rebellions and invasions, there had been one empire, one law, one ultimate authority stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. Now that unity shattered into 1,000 fragments, each seeking to reconstruct something like Rome's grandeur in many years. In the decades that followed Romulus Augustulus' quiet abdication, Western Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms, each ruled by Germanic peoples who had once lived beyond Rome's frontiers. The Visigoths controlled Spain and southern Gaul. The Vandals dominated North Africa from their capital at Carthage. The Ostrogoths ruled Italy under the brilliant Theodoric, who governed from Ravenna with a curious blend of Germanic military power and Roman administrative sophistication. Theodoric the Great embodied the contradictions of this transitional age. Raised as a hostage in Constantinople, educated in Roman literature and law, he could sign his name by tracing a golden stencil, but probably could not read the documents he signed. His court at Ravenna preserved Roman ceremony and employed Roman senators. Yet his power ultimately rested on the loyalty of Gothic warriors, who measured wealth in weapons and horses rather than estates and gold. Under Theodoric's rule, Italy experienced a generation of peace and prosperity that would not be matched again for centuries. Aqueducts were repaired, roads maintained, trade routes protected. The Roman Senate continued to meet. Roman law remained in force for Roman citizens, and Gothic law governed the Germanic population. It was an early experiment in what we might call multiculturalism, two legal systems coexisting under one crown, yet even this relative stability could not mask the fundamental transformation occurring across Western Europe. The cities that had been the heartbeat of Roman civilization were shrinking, their populations drifting back to the countryside as trade routes became dangerous and imperial subsidies dried up. Rome itself, which had once housed over 1 million inhabitants, may have contained fewer than 50,000 souls by the year 500. Into this vacuum stepped an institution that would define medieval Europe more than any king or kingdom: the Christian Church. Christianity had been growing in influence since Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century, but the collapse of imperial authority accelerated its rise to prominence. As Roman governors disappeared and imperial courts fell silent, bishops remained. They inherited not only spiritual authority but practical power, administering relief to the poor, negotiating with barbarian kings, preserving literacy, and learning in an increasingly fragmented world. In Rome itself, Pope Leo the Great had already demonstrated the Church's emerging temporal power when he rode out to meet Attila the Hun in 452, persuading the Scourge of God to spare the Eternal City. His successors would claim even greater authority, insisting that the Bishop of Rome held supremacy over all Christian churches and, by extension, all Christian rulers. This ecclesiastical revolution was perhaps most visible in the career of Pope Gregory the Great, who ruled from 590 to 604. Finding Rome's civil government in collapse, Gregory essentially became the city's secular ruler, organizing its defense, managing its food supply, and negotiating with Lombard invaders. More significantly, he dispatched missionaries to convert the pagan peoples who now ruled former Roman territories. The mission of Augustine to England in 597 exemplified this new papal ambition. Rather than lamenting the loss of Roman authority, Gregory sought to create a new kind of empire, a spiritual empire that would unite Europe's barbarian kingdoms under the authority of Christ and his vicar in Rome. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman Empire endured. From Constantinople, the Emperor Justinian watched the Western kingdoms with a mixture of contempt and ambition. These barbarian rulers, he believed, were mere squatters on imperial territory. The true emperor, the heir of Augustus and Constantine, still reigned on the Bosphorus. Justinian's attempt to reconquer the West, beginning in 533, would reshape the Mediterranean world. His brilliant general Belisarius swiftly destroyed the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, then turned his attention to Italy. The Gothic wars that followed would rage for nearly 20 years, devastating the Italian peninsula and reducing its population by perhaps half. When the smoke cleared, Justinian had achieved his dream of restored empire on paper. Imperial banners flew once again from Ravenna to Carthage, but the cost had been catastrophic. Italy lay in ruins, its cities depopulated, its agriculture destroyed. The Gothic kingdom that had preserved Roman civilization was gone, replaced by a distant imperial administration that could barely defend what it had conquered. The irony was profound. In seeking to restore the Roman Empire, Justinian had completed its destruction. The prosperous, sophisticated Gothic Italy of Theodoric became the impoverished, militarized wasteland that would soon fall to the next wave of barbarian invaders, the Lombards. As the 6th century drew to a close, Western Europe bore little resemblance to the unified, urban cosmopolitan world of classical antiquity. Trade had contracted to local markets, cities had shrunk to fortified strongholds, literary culture survived mainly in monasteries. The elaborate legal codes of Rome had given way to simpler, more personal systems of justice based on Germanic custom and Christian morality. Yet something new was being born from this apparent collapse. In the monasteries of Ireland, monks were copying and preserving classical texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. In the courts of Frankish kings, Roman administrative practices were blending with Germanic military traditions to create new forms of governance. In the workshops of barbarian craftsmen, classical artistic techniques were merging with Germanic decorative styles to produce entirely new aesthetic traditions. The medieval world was taking shape, not as a pale shadow of antiquity, but as something genuinely new, a civilization that would be neither Roman nor barbarian, but distinctly European. A world where spiritual authority would compete with temporal power, where local loyalties would challenge universal claims, where the dream of unity would persist even as political reality fragmented into countless competing jurisdictions. As we stand at this threshold between ancient and medieval, watching the last Roman emperor fade into obscurity and the first medieval kingdom struggle toward definition, we witness one of history's great transformations. The world that would produce Charlemagne and the Crusades, Gothic cathedrals, and scholastic philosophy was emerging from the ashes of Rome, but first that world would have to survive its own birth pangs. In the depths of a Frankish forest, sometime around the year 732, the future of European civilization hung in the balance. Charles Martel, his very name meaning the hammer, stood before an army unlike any that had challenged Christian Europe. Across the battlefield near Tours, the banners of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi fluttered in the October wind. Behind them stretched a Muslim army that had swept across the Pyrenees like a flood, conquering cities, burning churches, and driving all before them in their inexorable march toward the heart of Franklin. The Umayyad Caliphate had already transformed the Mediterranean world beyond recognition. From their capital in Damascus, the successors of Muhammad ruled an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. They had conquered Christian Syria, Christian Egypt, Christian North Africa. Now they stood poised to add Christian Gaul to their dominions. But Charles Martel was no ordinary opponent. Behind him stood not just the military might of the Franks, but the accumulated political genius of a dynasty that had been reshaping Western Europe for over a century. The story of Frankish ascendancy begins not with kings, but with mayors. While the Merovingian dynasty, the descendants of Clovis, who had first united the Frankish tribes, grew weak and divided, real power passed to their chief ministers, the mayors of the palace. These men, drawn from the powerful Arnulfing and Pippinid families, gradually accumulated the substance of royal authority while leaving the Merovingians with its empty forms. Charles Martel's grandfather, Pepin of Herstal, had reunited the Frankish kingdoms through military brilliance and political cunning. His son, Charles Martel, inherited not just his father's position, but his vision of Frankish destiny. Under Charles's leadership, the Franks became more than another barbarian kingdom. They became the sword and shield of Christian Europe. The Battle of Tours was more than a clash of armies. It was a collision of worlds. The Muslim forces represented the most dynamic civilization of the age, scientifically advanced, culturally sophisticated, militarily innovative. Their light cavalry, their composite bows, Their tactical flexibility had already proven superior to every army they had faced. Against them stood the mailed warriors of Francia, fighting on foot in tight formations, wielding the Francisca, the throwing axe that gave the Franks their name. When the lines finally closed, it was Germanic discipline against Arabian mobility, Christian desperation against Islamic confidence. The fighting raged from dawn until dusk, and when darkness fell, Abd al-Rahman lay dead among his warriors. The Muslim army, leaderless and far from home, melted away in the night, retreating back across the Pyrenees to lick wounds that would never fully heal. Charles Martel had saved Christian Europe, but more than that, he had announced the arrival of a new power. The Franks were no longer merely another post-Roman kingdom. They were the champions of Christendom, the rightful heirs to Rome's protective mission. Yet Charles never claimed the title of king. That revolutionary step would be taken by his son, Pepin the Short, in one of the most audacious political maneuvers in medieval history. The year 751 marked a watershed in European politics. For nearly 3 centuries, the Merovingian dynasty had provided the Franks with kings, even as real power slipped into other hands. The last of these shadow monarchs, Childeric III, was a pathetic figure, a long-haired king whose authority extended no further than his royal villa, whose every decision required the approval of his mayor of the palace. Pepin the Short faced a dilemma that would become archetypal in medieval politics. He possessed all the substance of power, but lacked its legitimacy. To resolve this contradiction, he turned to the one institution whose authority transcended tribal tradition and Germanic custom, the Church of Rome. Pope Zachary's response to Pepin's inquiry was revolutionary in its implications. It is better, the Pope declared, that he who has royal power should be called king rather than he who remains without royal power. With papal blessing, Pepin deposed Childeric III, shaved off the long hair that symbolized Merovingian royalty, and confined him to a monastery. The Frankish nobles assembled at Swenson's then elected Pepin as their king, but election alone was insufficient for Pepin's ambitions. In a ceremony unprecedented in Frankish history, he was anointed with holy oil by Boniface, the English missionary who had become Archbishop of the German territories. This anointing transformed Pepin from a successful usurper into a divinely sanctioned monarch, a king by the grace of God rather than merely by the consent of warriors. The alliance between the Carolingian dynasty, named for Charles Martel, and the papacy would reshape European politics for centuries. Pope Stephen II's desperate journey across the Alps in 754 to seek Frankish protection against the Lombards sealed this partnership with mutual oaths and solemn obligations. Pepin pledged to defend the Church and restore its territories. The Pope confirmed his royal dignity and promised eternal salvation for his dynasty. The Frankish conquest of the Lombard kingdom of Pavia fulfilled Pepin's side of this bargain, creating the Papal States and establishing the Pope as a temporal ruler in central Italy. More profoundly, it established the precedent that would echo through medieval history, the cooperation between spiritual and temporal authority in defense of Christian civilization. When Pepin died in 768, he divided his kingdom between his 2 sons according to Frankish custom, but fate or providence had other plans. The death of Carloman in 771 left his brother Charles as sole ruler of the Franks. History would know him as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, and under his reign the Carolingian dynasty would reach heights that dwarfed even the achievements of ancient Rome. Charlemagne inherited his grandfather's military genius, his father's political acumen, and something uniquely his own, a vision of Christian empire that would transform Europe forever. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, possessed of enormous physical energy and insatiable curiosity, he embodied the dynamism of Frankish culture at its zenith. His conquests began almost immediately. The Saxon Wars, lasting over 30 years, would push Frankish power to the Baltic Sea and forcibly convert the last pagan tribes of Germany to Christianity. The destruction of the Ewer kingdom brought vast treasures flowing into Frankish coffers and extended Carolingian authority to the Danube. The conquest of the Lombard kingdom made Charlemagne king of the Lombards and protector of the Pope. But it was the Spanish March, the buffer zone Charlemagne created south of the Pyrenees, that would generate the most enduring legend. The ambush at Roncesvalles in 778, where Charlemagne's rearguard was destroyed by Basque mountaineers, became an epic poetry, the heroic last stand of Roland against the Muslim host. Truth mattered less than meaning. Charlemagne had become the champion of Christendom, his paladins, the archetypal Christian knights. By the year 800, Charlemagne ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Oder, from the North Sea to central Italy. It was the largest political unit Western Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. More significantly, it was avowedly Christian in character, devoted to the protection and expansion of the faith that had become Europe's unifying ideology. The coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Day 800, in St. Peter's Basilica, represented the culmination of 3 centuries of political evolution. As Pope Leo III placed the imperial crown upon the Frankish king's head, the assembled crowd acclaimed him as Emperor of the Romans. The Western Roman Empire, dead for over 3 centuries, was symbolically reborn. Yet this new empire differed fundamentally from its ancient predecessor. Where Rome had been cosmopolitan and inclusive, absorbing conquered peoples into a universal citizenship, Charlemagne's empire remained essentially Germanic and Christian. Its law was personal rather than territorial. Franks lived under Frankish law, Lombards under Lombard law, Romans under Roman law. Its administration depended not on professional bureaucrats, but on personal loyalty between lord and vassal. Most crucially, this empire was conceived as the political expression of Christendom. Charlemagne saw himself not merely as a conqueror, but as the defender of the faithful, responsible before God for the spiritual as well as temporal welfare of his subjects. His legislation regulated everything from clerical celibacy to the proper observation of holy days, from the establishment of schools to the standardization of church music. The Carolingian Renaissance that flowered under Charlemagne's patronage represented more than cultural revival. It was a systematic attempt to recreate Christian civilization on new foundations. At the Palace School of Aachen, scholars gathered from across Europe, Alcuin from England, Theodule from Spain, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Einhard from Germany. Together they worked to preserve classical learning, reform ecclesiastical education, and create a common intellectual culture for the Carolingian elite. The Caroline minuscule script developed in Carolingian scriptoriums would become the foundation of medieval literacy. The standardized liturgy promulgated by Charlemagne's scholars would unite Christian worship across Europe. The educational reforms mandated by the Admonitio Generalis of 789 would create the first systematic attempt at universal education in European history. Yet beneath this cultural flowering lay tensions that would ultimately prove destructive. The empire's unity depended entirely on Charlemagne's personal authority and extraordinary energy. Its vast extent made effective communication and control nearly impossible with 8th-century technology. Its diverse populations shared little beyond Christian faith and subjection to Frankish rule. When Charlemagne died at Aachen in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited not just an empire, but an impossible task. Louis was a deeply religious man, perhaps too religious for the practical demands of medieval kingship. His attempts to impose moral reform on the Frankish nobility, his preference for clerical advisors over secular warriors, his obsession with his own salvation, all of these gradually alienated the military elite, upon whom Carolingian power ultimately rested. The crisis came to a head in 833 when Louis's own sons rebelled against him, supported by bishops who declared his rule spiritually inadequate. The Field of Lies, where Louis's army melted away as his supporters abandoned him, marked the beginning of the end for unified Carolingian rule. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formally partitioned Charlemagne's empire among Louis's 3 surviving sons. Charles the Bald received the western territories that would become France. Louis the German took the eastern regions that would evolve into the Holy Roman Empire. Lothair retained the title of emperor and the central territories stretching from Italy to the North Sea, an awkward geographical arrangement that would be a source of conflict for centuries. This partition was more than political division, it was the birth of European nationalism. The Strasbourg Oaths, sworn by Charles and Louis in 842, recorded in both Romance and Germanic languages so their respective armies could understand, marked the first recognition that Charlemagne's empire had split along linguistic and cultural lines that would eventually crystallize into separate nations. As the 9th century progressed, the Carolingian kingdoms faced new threats that their weakened condition made increasingly difficult to resist. Viking longships appeared in rivers across Europe, their crews raiding monasteries and cities with impunity. Muslim fleets from Spain and North Africa established bases in southern France and Italy. Magyar horsemen from the steppes devastated Germany and Italy with tactics reminiscent of the Huns. The great age of Carolingian unity was ending, but its legacy would endure. The idea of a Christian empire defending the faith against external enemies had become embedded in European consciousness. The fusion of Germanic military culture with Roman administrative tradition and Christian moral authority would provide the foundation for medieval civilization. The educational and cultural reforms of the Carolingian Renaissance would preserve classical learning through Europe's darkest centuries. Most importantly, the Carolingian experiment had demonstrated that barbarian Europe could aspire to more than tribal warfare and petty kingdoms. Under the right circumstances, with sufficient vision and energy, it could create empires that rivaled ancient Roman extent and surpassed it in moral purpose. The dream of Christian empire would not die with the Treaty of Verdun. It would resurface again and again throughout medieval history in the aspirations of Ottoman emperors, in the rhetoric of the Crusades, in the ambitions of would-be universal monarchs from Frederick Barbarossa to Napoleon Bonaparte. But first, Europe would have to survive the violent century that followed Charlemagne's death, when Viking axes, Muslim swords, and Magyar arrows would test whether the civilization he had built could endure the storms that were gathering on every horizon. The morning mist clung to the waters of the Seine as the dragon-prowed longships emerged from the river bend like phantoms from a nightmare. It was the year 845, and the monks of St. Denis could hear them coming, the rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water, the creak of leather and rope, the low murmur of voices speaking in a tongue that sounded like the growling of wolves. From the monastery walls they watched in terror as nearly 100 vessels materialized from the dawn fog, their carved dragon heads seeming to breathe fire in the early light. Leading this spectral fleet was a man whose name would echo through history with all the resonance of thunder, Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether he was the same Ragnar of legend, the semi-mythical king who supposedly died in a snake pit, cursing his enemies with his final breath, matters less than what he represented. He was the embodiment of a new age of violence, the herald of 3 centuries of raids that would transform European civilization as profoundly as any barbarian invasion. But to understand the Vikings, we must first understand what drove them from their Scandinavian homelands onto the wine-dark seas of Europe. The 8th and 9th centuries had witnessed a perfect storm of circumstances in the north. Population growth in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had outpaced agricultural capacity, creating pressure for expansion. Political consolidation under emerging kings had displaced traditional chieftains and their war bands. Perhaps most critically, Scandinavian shipwrights had perfected the long ship, a vessel of revolutionary design that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, carry 40 warriors in swift silence, and be beached on any shore for lightning raids. These ships were marvels of medieval technology, their clinker-built hulls flexible enough to bend with the waves, their shallow draft allowing them to penetrate deep into European river systems. A Viking fleet could appear anywhere there was water, striking Paris via the Seine, reaching Seville through the Guadalquivir, penetrating the heart of Russia along the Volga and Dnieper. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. For centuries, European monasteries and towns had grown accustomed to safety. The Carolingian peace had created a false sense of security, allowing wealth to accumulate in poorly defended religious houses and merchant settlements. The Vikings shattered this illusion with systematic brutality that seemed to come from nowhere and strike everywhere. Yet the Viking Age was far more complex than simple piracy and plunder. These Northmen were simultaneously destroyers and creators, raiders and traders, pagans and eventually Christians. Their dragon ships carried not just weapons but also amber from the Baltic, furs from the Arctic, silver from the Islamic world. They established trading posts from Dublin to Kiev, created the first Russian state, and opened commercial routes that connected Europe to Byzantium and the caliphates of the East. The early raids, beginning in the 790s with the attack on Lindisfarne, followed a predictable pattern. Swift-moving Viking fleets would strike coastal monasteries and towns during the summer raiding season, seizing portable wealth, gold, silver, slaves, before retreating to their homeland strongholds for winter. The shock value was immense. These pagan warriors showed no respect for Christian sanctuaries, treating bishops and abbots as merely another source of plunder. But by the middle of the 9th century, the Vikings had evolved from seasonal raiders into permanent occupiers. The great army that landed in England in 865 represented a new phase of Viking expansion, not hit-and-run raids, but systematic conquest and settlement. Under leaders like Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, this massive force carved up Anglo-Saxon England, establishing the Danelaw in the north and east, while reducing the remaining English kingdoms to tributary status. The Vikings who established themselves in England, Ireland, and Normandy were not mere barbarian conquerors. They brought sophisticated legal traditions, advanced agricultural techniques, and commercial networks that revitalized European trade. The Thing assemblies of Scandinavian law provided models for representative government. Viking traders created the first truly international market economy in medieval Europe, their silver dirhams circulating from Greenland to Central Asia. Perhaps most remarkably, These pagan raiders proved remarkably adaptable to Christian civilization. The Vikings who settled in Normandy under Rollo became some of the most enthusiastic promoters of Christian culture, building magnificent cathedrals and monasteries. Those who established the Kingdom of Dublin created Ireland's first urban centers. The Varangians who founded the Rus state at Kiev became the nucleus of Russian Orthodox civilization. This adaptability was nowhere more evident than in the career of Rollo, the Viking leader who became the first Duke of Normandy. After years of raiding along the French coast, Rollo negotiated the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte with King Charles the Simple in 911. In exchange for defending the mouth of the Seine against other Viking attacks, Rollo received formal recognition as ruler of the territory that would become Normandy. The transformation was astonishing. Within 2 generations, Rollo's descendants had become thoroughly Frankish in culture, Christian in religion, and French in language. Yet they retained the Viking military genius and appetite for conquest that would make them the most successful warriors of medieval Europe. Duke William's conquest of England in 1066 represented the ultimate triumph of Viking adaptability. Scandinavian warriors thoroughly acculturated to Frankish civilization, conquering England in the name of feudal legitimacy and papal blessing. But the Vikings were not the only threat facing 9th and 10th century Europe. From the east came the Magyars, nomadic horsemen whose tactics and temperament recalled the hunts of Attila's age. These mounted archers swept across the Carpathian Basin around 895, establishing themselves in the Pannonian Plain and launching devastating raids deep into Western Europe. The Magyar threat was qualitatively different from the Viking menace. Where the Vikings came by sea in manageable numbers, the Magyars moved across land in vast tribal migrations. Where Viking raids were primarily economic, seeking portable wealth, Magyar attacks were existential, threatening the complete displacement of existing populations. Their mobility was legendary. Magyar armies could strike Bavaria and Burgundy simultaneously, devastating thousands of square miles before any effective defense could be organized. The annals of the period convey the terror these horse archers inspired. The Hungarians, wrote one chronicler, came like lightning and departed like thunder, leaving behind only death and desolation. Their composite bows could penetrate mail at long range. Their ponies could survive on grass and bark. Their tactics of feigned retreat and encirclement had been perfected on the steppes of Central Asia. For nearly half a century, Magyar raids paralyzed Central Europe. They destroyed monasteries from Regensburg to Tours, burned cities from Pavia to Orleans, and reduced vast regions to wasteland. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical damage. Here was an enemy that seemed to embody the apocalyptic horsemen of Revelation, pagans whose very presence suggested divine wrath against Christian Europe. The turning point came at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where Otto I of Germany decisively defeated a massive Magyar army. The victory was total. The Magyar military system, dependent on mobility and surprise, could not recover from such a catastrophic defeat. Within a generation, the surviving Magyars had settled permanently in Hungary, adopting Christianity and feudal organization under King Stephen I. Simultaneously, Muslim raids from Spain and North Africa added a third dimension to Europe's security crisis. Saracen fleets established bases in southern France, Corsica, and Sardinia, from which they launched attacks deep into the Frankish heartland. The Muslim fortress at Fraxinetum controlled the Alpine passes for decades, effectively severing communication between Italy and the rest of Western Europe. These multiple invasions created a crisis that conventional Carolingian military organization could not address. The empire's army, designed for seasonal campaigns against neighboring kingdoms, proved hopelessly inadequate against simultaneous attacks by highly mobile enemies. The response was a military revolution that would define medieval warfare for centuries, the rise of heavy cavalry, and the fortification of Europe. The development of the stirrup, probably introduced from Asia in the 8th century, had already begun transforming European warfare by making possible the devastating shock charge of mounted warriors. Under the pressure of Viking, Magyar, and Muslim attacks, this innovation accelerated the evolution of knightly warfare. The miles, the heavy cavalrymen who would become the medieval knight, emerged as Europe's answer to nomadic horse archers and seaborne raiders. Equally important was the fortification revolution. Across Europe, thousands of castles, fortified towns, and fortified bridges began appearing in the 9th and 10th centuries. These were not primarily offensive weapons, but defensive responses to the new reality of constant threat. A Viking army might overwhelm a monastery or undefended town, but even a modest castle could resist attack and provide refuge for surrounding populations. The political implications of these military changes were profound. The elaborate administrative machinery of the Carolingian Empire gave way to more localized personal forms of authority. Counts and dukes who could protect their territories gained autonomy from distant kings who could not. The feudal system that would dominate medieval Europe emerged directly from the need to provide local defense against external threats. Yet this apparent fragmentation concealed a deeper transformation. The invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries, terrifying as they were for those who endured them, ultimately strengthened European civilization by forcing rapid adaptation and innovation. The Vikings, Magyars, and Muslims who seemed bent on destruction actually accelerated Europe's military, political, and economic development. By the year 1000, the Great Age of Invasions was ending. The Vikings who had not settled as farmers and merchants were being absorbed into the emerging kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The Magyars had become the Christian kingdom of Hungary. Muslim raids had been contained or eliminated by effective local defense. The last remnants of the Carolingian Empire were giving way to new monarchies, France, Germany, England, that would define European politics for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the crucible of invasion had forged a new European identity. The polyglot populations of the former Roman Empire had been welded together by shared adversity into something recognizably medieval. Latin Christianity had become the dominant cultural force from Scotland to Sicily. Feudal institutions provided a common framework for military and political organization. The ideal of knighthood united warrior elites across ethnic and linguistic boundaries. The monastery of Cluny, founded in 909 at the height of the invasion period, symbolized this transformation. Its revolutionary reform movement would spread to thousands of religious houses, creating networks of spiritual authority that transcended political boundaries. The Cluniac emphasis on moral purity, liturgical beauty, and social responsibility represented a confidence in Christian civilization's ability to reform itself and resist external threats. As the millennium approached, apocalyptic fears mixed with cautious optimism. The invasions that had seemed to herald the end of the world had instead produced a more unified, more dynamic, more resilient European civilization. The technological innovations, institutional adaptations, and cultural syntheses forced by external pressure had created the foundation for medieval Europe's greatest achievements. The Vikings, who had once burned Paris, now ruled Normandy as Christian dukes. The Magyars, who had terrorized Germany, now defended Christendom against other steppe peoples. The Muslims, who had raided the Frankish heartland, had been contained behind the Pyrenees and integrated into the complex diplomatic system of medieval Iberia. Europe in the year 1000 stood poised on the threshold of its greatest age. The defensive phase was ending. The expansive phase was about to begin. The knights who had learned to fight Magyar horse archers would soon ride east toward Jerusalem. The merchants who had learned to trade with Viking raiders would soon establish commercial networks spanning the known world. The kings who had learned to defend their territories would soon dream of conquest and empire. The age of invasions was over. The age of the Crusades was about to begin. On a frost-covered field near Hastings, in the fading light of October 14, 1066, King Harold Godwin's son fell with an arrow through his eye, and with him died the last hope of Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman knights who surged over his shield wall that evening were not merely conquering a kingdom. They were completing a transformation that had been 3 centuries in the making. The Europe that emerged from the invasions and chaos of the 9th century bore little resemblance to either the classical world of Rome or the tribal societies of the early Middle Ages. By the year 1000, a new civilization had crystallized, feudal, Christian, and distinctly medieval in character. This was the Europe of stone castles and armored knights, of soaring cathedrals and learned monks, of emerging kingdoms and expanding frontiers. It was a world where spiritual and temporal authority competed for supremacy, where personal loyalty bound men in chains stronger than law, where the dream of Christian unity coexisted with the reality of endless fragmentation. To understand this revolutionary society, we must begin with the feudal bond itself, that web of personal relationships that replaced the impersonal institutions of the Roman Empire. Feudalism was born from necessity, forged in the crucible of invasion and collapse. When central authority failed and money disappeared from circulation, when cities shrank and trade routes became death traps, new forms of organization emerged based on the most reliable currency of all, military service in exchange for land. The ritual of homage that created these bonds possessed an almost sacramental quality. Kneeling before his lord, the vassal would place his hands between those of his superior and swear an oath of fealty. I become your man and I promise to serve you faithfully against all who may live or die. In return, the lord would grant him a fief, typically land, but sometimes an office or the right to collect revenues sufficient to support him in the style befitting his station. This ceremony created obligations that flowed both ways. The vassal owed his lord military service, typically 40 days a year, counsel when requested, and various financial payments. The lord owed his vassal protection, justice, and maintenance of the fief. It was a contract written not on parchment, but in the souls of men, enforced not by courts, but by honor and necessity. Yet feudalism was never a uniform system. In northern France, where it reached its most developed form, the bonds of vassalage created elaborate hierarchies stretching from the king down to simple knights. In Germany, older tribal traditions persisted alongside feudal innovations. In England before 1066, a different system of lordship prevailed, based more on land tenure than personal homage. The Norman conquest would impose the French feudal model on England with systematic thoroughness. William the Conqueror's genius lay not merely in winning the Battle of Hastings, but in his methodical reconstruction of English society. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, represented the most comprehensive survey of land tenure in medieval Europe, a blueprint for feudal reorganization that would endure for centuries. Every acre of England was recorded, every village assessed, every landholder identified and bound to his superiors by feudal obligation. Where Harold Godwinson had ruled through a complex web of personal relationships and traditional loyalties, William created a pyramid of tenure with himself at the apex, every knight and baron holding land directly or indirectly from the crown. Well, this transformation was replicated across Europe as emerging monarchies sought to impose order on the decentralized violence of the post-Carolingian age. In France, the Capetian dynasty that came to power in 987 began the slow process of extending royal authority beyond the Isle de France. In Germany, the Ottoman dynasty created the Holy Roman Empire, reviving Charlemagne's dream of Christian universal monarchy. The German experiment proved particularly fascinating in its blend of ambition and contradiction. Odoacer's coronation as emperor in 1962 marked the beginning of an institution that would endure for nearly a millennium. Yet the Holy Roman Empire was never truly holy, rarely Roman, and barely an empire. It was instead a collection of duchies, bishoprics, and free cities held together by the personal authority of the emperor and the shared fiction of Roman revival. The Ottonians' reliance on the church for administration created one of medieval Europe's most distinctive features, the imperial church system. Bishops and abbots became the emperor's primary agents, governing territories, leading armies, and collecting revenues. This ecclesiastical bureaucracy provided the literate, educated personnel that secular government lacked, but it also created dangerous tensions between imperial and papal authority. These tensions exploded in the investiture controversy that would dominate the late 11th century. When Pope Gregory VII declared in his Dictatus Pape that the Roman pontiff alone could depose emperors, he challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The resulting conflict between empire and papacy would reshape European politics for generations. The dramatic confrontation at Canossa in 1007, where Emperor Henry IV knelt barefoot in the snow for 3 days seeking papal forgiveness, seemed to demonstrate the supremacy of spiritual over temporal power, yet the image was deceptive. Henry's apparent humiliation masked a shrewd political calculation. By performing penance, he escaped excommunication and regained the moral authority necessary to crush his rebellious subjects. The investiture controversy reflected deeper changes in church organization and ideology. The monastic reform movement that began at Cluny in the 10th century had spread across Europe, creating networks of religious houses committed to moral purification and ecclesiastical independence. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century extended this spirit to the secular clergy, demanding clerical celibacy, condemning simony, and insisting on papal supremacy over all Christian institutions. This Reformed Church possessed unprecedented moral authority and institutional sophistication. The College of Cardinals, established to elect the Pope, freed papal succession from imperial or aristocratic manipulation. Canon law, systematically codified for the first time, created a legal system that rivaled and sometimes superseded secular courts. The papal curia evolved into medieval Europe's most efficient administrative machine, capable of governing a spiritual empire that stretched from Ireland to the Holy Land. The transformation of the Church paralleled and reinforced the broader European Renaissance of the 11th century. Population was growing rapidly after centuries of stagnation or decline. new agricultural techniques, the three-field system, the heavy plow, the horse collar, increased productivity and supported larger communities. Towns were emerging throughout Europe as centers of craft production and commercial exchange. This urban revival represented a fundamental shift in European civilization. For centuries, the countryside had been everything: the source of wealth, the seat of power, the center of cultural life. Now, cities were reappearing as independent forces, their merchants and craftsmen challenging the monopoly of feudal elites. The communes that emerged in northern Italy and Flanders created new forms of political organization based on commercial rather than military values. Venice exemplified this urban renaissance. Built on mudflats in a lagoon, possessing neither fertile land nor natural resources, the city had transformed itself into medieval Europe's greatest commercial power through maritime trade and financial innovation. Venetian merchants established trading posts from Constantinople to Alexandria. Their ducats became the international currency of the Mediterranean. Their galley fleets challenged the naval supremacy of Byzantium and Islam. The Venetian model inspired imitators throughout Europe. Genoa and Pisa competed for control of Western Mediterranean trade. The Hanseatic League united German cities in a commercial confederation that dominated Baltic commerce. Flemish towns like Bruges and Ghent became centers of textile production that supplied markets from London to Novgorod. This commercial revolution required new financial instruments and legal frameworks. Italian bankers pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, and joint stock companies. Merchant law evolved to govern transactions between parties from different kingdoms and legal traditions. Fairs like those at Champagne became international centers where goods, money, and ideas circulated freely across political boundaries. The intellectual implications of this economic transformation were profound. Trade required literacy, numeracy, and legal sophistication. Urban schools emerged to train merchants in practical skills, while cathedral schools revived classical learning to educate the clergy. The rediscovery of Aristotle through Arabic translations began transforming European philosophy and natural science. Yet this burgeoning prosperity existed in constant tension with the military values of feudal society. Knights who measured honor in terms of martial prowess and landed wealth viewed merchants with suspicion, bordering on contempt. The Church taught that commercial profit was potentially sinful, that a rich man could no more enter heaven than a camel could pass through the eye of a needle. These tensions were most visible in the emergence of knightly culture itself. The knights of the 11th century were not the courtly figures of later romance, but professional warriors whose lives revolved around violence. Their heavy cavalry tactics, perfected in response to Viking and Magyar raids, had made them the dominant military force in Western Europe. The transformation of mounted warriors into a self-conscious military caste occurred gradually throughout the 10th and 11th centuries. Originally, the Miles was simply a mounted soldier distinguished from infantry by his horse and equipment, but not necessarily by birth or legal status. By 1100, knighthood had become a hereditary profession with its own ideology, customs, and sacred rituals. The dubbing ceremony that marked a young man's entry into knighthood took on quasi-religious significance. The candidate would spend a night in prayer, confess his sins, hear Mass, and receive his weapons from the hands of a priest or established knight. The sword he girded on was blessed for the defense of church and the protection of the weak. The spurs he wore symbolized his obligation to pursue honor through martial deeds. This militarization of European society produced both remarkable achievements and terrible excesses. The same knights who terrorized peasants and pillaged churches also provided the military backbone that made possible Europe's first expansion beyond its traditional boundaries. The Reconquista in Spain, the conquest of England by the Normans, the Crusades in the East, all depended on the offensive capabilities of feudal heavy cavalry. The Spanish Reconquista represented the longest and most successful of these expansionist movements. The Christian kingdoms of Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon gradually pushed southward against the fragmented Muslim taifas, combining religious zeal with practical land hunger. The capture of Toledo by Alfonso VI in 1085 marked a decisive shift in the balance of power, giving the Christians control of the strategic center of the Iberian Peninsula. The response, the invasion of the puritanical Almoravids from North Africa, temporarily halted Christian expansion and demonstrated the resilience of Islamic Spain. Yet the basic dynamic remained unchanged. The Christian North possessed superior heavy cavalry, while the Muslim South suffered from political fragmentation and declining military effectiveness. This pattern of Christian expansion would characterize the entire period from 1000 to 1300. In Sicily, Norman adventurers like Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger carved out a kingdom that blended Norman military efficiency with Byzantine administrative sophistication and Islamic cultural refinement. In Eastern Europe, German knights pushed beyond the Elbe River, establishing colonies and converting pagan Slavic tribes through a combination of missionary activity and military conquest. Yet the most dramatic expression of this expansionist energy was already taking shape as the 11th century drew to a close. In 1095, Pope Urban II would issue a call that would echo across Christendom, summoning knights to take the cross and march east to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. The age of the Crusades was about to begin. The First Crusade represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the 11th century: the reform of the Church, the militarization of society, the growth of papal authority, the expansion of European power. It was also something entirely new: a holy war that would engage the imagination and energies of medieval Europe for the next 2 centuries. But to understand the Crusades, we must first appreciate the world that produced them, a Europe that had emerged from the chaos of invasion and collapse to become a dynamic, expansionist civilization capable of projecting power across vast distances. The knights who would storm the walls of Jerusalem in 1099 were the products of feudal society at its peak, disciplined, motivated, and equipped with the military technology and organizational structures necessary for distant conquest. The Europe of 1100 bore little resemblance to the Europe of 900. In 2 centuries, a collection of weak kingdoms and petty duchies had transformed itself into a civilization capable of challenging Byzantium and Islam on equal terms. The foundations had been laid for the greatest achievements of medieval culture: the Gothic cathedrals, the universities, the commercial revolution, the flowering of vernacular literature. Yet this transformation had come at a cost. The violence that created feudal society never entirely disappeared. It simply became more organized, more purposeful, more efficient. The same military system that provided security and enabled expansion also perpetuated endemic warfare between competing feudal lords. The same commercial revolution that created unprecedented prosperity also generated new forms of inequality and social tension. As the 11th century ended and the 12th began, medieval Europe stood at the height of its power and confidence. The invasions were over, the frontiers were expanding, the Church was triumphant. The stage was set for the greatest adventure in medieval history, the attempt to reclaim the Holy Land and establish Christian kingdoms in the heart of the Islamic world. The Age of the Crusades was about to begin. In the Cathedral of Clermont, on a November day in 1095, Pope Urban II rose to deliver a speech that would drench the medieval world in blood for the next 2 centuries. The assembled crowd, bishops, abbots, nobles, and common folk, had come expecting routine ecclesiastical business. Instead, they heard words that would echo through history with the force of revelation. Deus vult, God wills it. The cry erupted spontaneously from thousands of throats as Urban painted a picture of Christians suffering in the East, of pilgrims murdered and churches desecrated, of the Holy Sepulchre itself defiled by infidel hands. But Urban's vision extended far beyond the liberation of Jerusalem. He spoke of a new kind of warfare, not the endless feudal conflicts that had been tearing Europe apart, but a holy war that would unite all Christendom against the enemies of God. Knights who had been damning their souls through violence against fellow Christians could now find salvation through violence against Muslims. The Church would protect their lands and families while they served Christ in arms. Most revolutionary of all, Urban promised immediate remission of sins for all who took the cross. Here was the first plenary indulgence in Christian history, complete forgiveness for all past transgressions, guaranteed entry into paradise for those who died in holy combat. The response was overwhelming, instantaneous, and utterly transformative. Yet to understand this explosion of crusading fervor, we must look beyond Urban's charismatic oratory to the deeper currents that made Europe ready for such an adventure. The Crusades were not an aberration, but the logical culmination of trends that had been building for centuries. The reform movement that had swept through the Church since the 10th century had militarized Christian ideology in unprecedented ways. The Peace of God movement had taught that violence could be righteous if directed against God's enemies. The Gregorian reforms had asserted papal authority over secular rulers, creating the ideological framework for papal direction of warfare. The Spanish Reconquista had already demonstrated that war against Muslims was not merely permissible but spiritually meritorious. Perhaps most crucially, European society had produced a warrior class desperately in need of employment. The knightly elite that had emerged from feudal militarization possessed tremendous destructive capacity but limited constructive purpose. Chronic warfare between petty lords was devastating Christian communities without achieving any meaningful political or religious objective. The Crusades promised to redirect this violence toward a worthy goal. The immediate catalyst came from Byzantium, where Emperor Alexios I Komnenos faced catastrophic military defeat at the hands of the Seljuk Turks. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 had cost the empire most of Anatolia and brought Muslim armies within striking distance of Constantinople itself. Alexios' desperate appeal to Urban for military assistance offered the Pope an unprecedented opportunity to assert papal leadership over Eastern Christianity while addressing Western Europe's endemic violence. What emerged was far more than Alexios had requested or Urban had initially envisioned. The response to the call for crusade revealed depths of religious passion that no one had anticipated. Across Europe, men and women from every social level abandoned their normal lives to take the cross. Great lords mortgaged their estates to finance expeditions eastward. Poor peasants sold their few possessions and joined the exodus. Even children were swept up in the movement, forming tragic bands of would-be crusaders who never reached the Holy Land. The First Crusade began not with the organized armies Urban had envisioned, but with a chaotic popular movement led by visionaries and fanatics. Peter the Hermit's ragtag band of peasants and urban poor reached Constantinople months before any knightly army, only to be slaughtered by the Turks in Asia Minor. The People's Crusade revealed both the extraordinary power of crusading ideology and its dangerous capacity to inspire ill-conceived religious enthusiasm. Yet when the real crusading armies finally assembled, the disciplined forces led by Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, and other great nobles, they proved formidable beyond anything the Muslim world had faced. These were not mere raiders or seasonal campaigners, but entire societies on the march, prepared for years of sustained warfare thousands of miles from home. The siege of Antioch in 1097 to 1098 demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of crusading warfare. For 8 months, the Christian army maintained its investment of this formidable fortress, enduring starvation, disease, and repeated attacks by relief armies. When the city finally fell through treachery, the Crusaders' discovery of the Holy Lance, supposedly the weapon that pierced Christ's side, transformed their desperate situation into miraculous victory. Religious fervor became military advantage as demoralized troops found new strength in sacred relics and divine visions. The capture of Jerusalem on July 15, 1099, marked the climax of medieval Europe's first great expansion beyond its traditional boundaries. The slaughter that followed, when Crusaders waded ankle-deep in blood through the Temple Mount, horrified even contemporary observers. Yet for most Europeans, the fall of the Holy City represented the ultimate validation of their faith, proof that God had indeed chosen Latin Christianity for universal dominion. The establishment of the Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli created an entirely new political phenomenon, European colonies in the heart of the Islamic world. These were not temporary conquests, but permanent settlements, complete with feudal institutions, Latin churches, and European laws transplanted to the Levantine soil. The challenge facing these new states was immense. Tiny Christian enclaves surrounded by hostile Muslim populations. They could survive only through constant military vigilance and periodic reinforcement from Europe. Their very existence depended on maintaining the flow of crusading enthusiasm that had brought them into being. The military orders that emerged to meet this challenge represented one of medieval Europe's most distinctive institutional innovations. The Knights Templar, founded around 1119 to protect pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem, combined monastic vows with military service in a synthesis that would have seemed contradictory to earlier Christian thought. The Knights Hospitaller evolved from a medical order caring for sick pilgrims into a military force rivaling the Templars in wealth and power. These military monks embodied the crusading ideal in its purest form, warriors who had renounced worldly gain for spiritual reward, whose entire existence was devoted to perpetual holy war against the enemies of Christ. Their massive fortifications dotted the Crusader states. Their disciplined forces provided the backbone of Christian defense. Their international networks supplied the constant flow of men and money necessary for survival. Yet the Crusader states' greatest asset, their connection to European Christendom, was also their fundamental weakness. They remained forever foreign implants in a Middle Eastern body politic dependent on external support that inevitably fluctuated with European political conditions and religious enthusiasm. The fragility of this position became apparent with the fall of Edessa in 1144, which triggered the Second Crusade. The response to this disaster revealed how deeply crusading ideology had penetrated European consciousness. When Bernard of Clairvaux preached the new crusade, kings themselves took the cross. Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany led their armies eastward in the most prestigious expedition since the First Crusade. The complete failure of the Second Crusade, with both royal armies destroyed in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land, dealt a severe blow to crusading confidence. For the first time, European Christians were forced to confront the possibility that God might not always grant victory to his chosen warriors. The theological implications were profound and troubling. This crisis of faith prepared the way for Saladin's brilliant campaign of reconquest. The Kurdish general, who had unified Egypt and Syria under his rule, represented everything the divided Crusader states were not: united, motivated, and blessed with brilliant leadership. His victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 destroyed the military power of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and opened the way for the recapture of the Holy City itself. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin sent shockwaves throughout Europe, comparable to those that had followed Urban II's original call. The Third Crusade that resulted, the King's Crusade, led by Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus, and Richard the Lionheart, represented the high-water mark of medieval royal involvement in the crusading movement. Yet even this massive effort achieved only partial success. Frederick drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, depriving the expedition of its most experienced leader. Philip Augustus returned to France after the capture of Acre, more concerned with European politics than Eastern conquests. Only Richard remained to face Saladin in a contest that would become the stuff of legend. The duel between Richard and Saladin was more than a military confrontation. It was a clash between two ideals of kingship, two concepts of holy war, two visions of divine purpose. Richard embodied the feudal warrior king at his most magnificent, brave to the point of recklessness, generous to friends and terrible to enemies, devoted to military glory above all other considerations. Saladin represented something newer and perhaps more sophisticated, the cultured Muslim prince who combined martial prowess with learning, justice with military necessity, political calculation with religious devotion. Their mutual respect, documented in contemporary chronicles, suggested possibilities for coexistence that the extremists on both sides rejected. Richard's treaty with Saladin in 1192, guaranteeing Christian access to Jerusalem while acknowledging Muslim sovereignty, represented a pragmatic compromise that might have provided the foundation for lasting peace. Instead, the Fourth Crusade demonstrated how far the movement had diverged from its original ideals. The Venetian diversion of the crusading army to Constantinople in 1204 resulted in the sack of the greatest Christian city in the world and the establishment of the Latin Empire of Byzantium, the spectacle of Western Christians looting Eastern Christian churches, selling Byzantine relics in European markets, and installing Latin patriarchs in orthodoxies revealed the extent to which political and economic motives had corrupted the crusading ideal. Yet the impact of the Crusades on European civilization extended far beyond their military and political failures. The massive movement of people, goods, and ideas between East and West accelerated cultural and technological exchange on an unprecedented scale. European merchants established permanent bases in Eastern ports, creating commercial networks that would survive long after the last Crusader kingdom fell. The intellectual consequences were equally profound. Contact with Islamic civilization exposed European scholars to Greek philosophical texts that had been lost in the West, Arabic scientific works that were centuries ahead of European knowledge, and medical treatises that revolutionized European practice. The translation schools of Spain and Sicily, stimulated by crusading contact with Islamic learning, began the process of cultural synthesis that would culminate in the scholastic philosophy of the 13th century. The Crusades also accelerated internal European development in unexpected ways. The financial demands of Eastern expeditions stimulated banking innovations, particularly in the Italian city-states that financed and provisioned the crusading armies. The legal privileges granted to crusaders encouraged the development of canon law and international legal concepts. The indulgence system pioneered for the Crusades became a permanent feature of medieval religious life. Perhaps most significantly, the Crusades created the first truly European identity. For the first time since Charlemagne, Christians from Ireland to Hungary united around a common cause that transcended local loyalties and national boundaries. The ideal of Christendom, a united Christian civilization standing against its external enemies, achieved its most complete expression in the crusading movement. This unity was always more symbolic than real, as the constant conflicts between crusading armies demonstrated. French and German crusaders fought each other as readily as they fought Muslims. Italian merchants sold supplies to Saladin while publicly supporting the Christian cause. Crusader barons formed alliances with Muslim neighbors against fellow Christians. Yet the ideal persisted, providing a framework for European self-understanding that would endure long after the fall of Acre in 1291. The concept of a Christian commonwealth, with the Pope as its spiritual head and the Holy Roman Emperor as its temporal leader, became a permanent feature of medieval political theory, even as political reality moved in increasingly national directions. The later Crusades, the 5th through the 8th, revealed the movement's gradual transformation from spontaneous religious enthusiasm into calculated political enterprise. Frederick II's bloodless acquisition of Jerusalem through negotiation rather than conquest horrified traditionalists who expected crusading to involve actual fighting. The Crusades against European heretics, Cathars in southern France, pagans in the Baltic, expanded the concept of holy war to include internal enemies of Orthodox Christianity. By 1200, the crusading movement had fundamentally altered both European and Islamic civilization. The Muslim world had been forced to develop new forms of unity and military organization in response to the Christian threat. The concept of jihad, previously a relatively minor theme in Islamic thought, became central to Muslim self-understanding. The cultural flowering of Ayyubid and Mamluk civilization was stimulated partly by the need to compete with the aggressive Christian West. For Europe, the Crusades represented both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in demonstrating the continent's new power and confidence. Tragedy in revealing the destructive potential of religious fanaticism unchecked by political wisdom or moral restraint. The same spiritual energy that built Gothic cathedrals and founded universities also inspired massacres of Jews in the Rhineland and the sack of Constantinople. As the 12th century ended, the age of the Great Crusades was passing, though the ideal would persist for centuries more. The failure to maintain Christian rule in the Holy Land forced Europeans to reconsider their relationship with the wider world and their understanding of divine providence. The easy assumption that God favored Christian arms had been shattered by repeated defeats and disappointments, yet the century of the Crusades had transformed Europe irrevocably. The continent that had once cowered behind its frontiers now projected power across 3 continents. The church that had once struggled to maintain basic order now claimed authority over kings and emperors. The knightly class that had once terrorized European peasants now dreamed of conquest in distant lands. The medieval world had reached its first great climax. The age of expansion and confidence was giving way to new challenges. The intellectual revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries, the commercial transformation of European society, the emergence of powerful monarchies that would challenge papal authority and feudal fragmentation. The foundations had been laid for the greatest achievements of medieval civilization, but also for the tensions and conflicts that would ultimately destroy the unified Christendom of which the Crusaders had dreamed. In the year 1140, in the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, just north of Paris, Abbot Sucher stood transfixed as colored light poured through his revolutionary new windows, transforming stone and shadow into something approaching the divine. What Sucher witnessed that day was more than architectural innovation. It was the birth of a new aesthetic that would define the High Middle Ages as completely as military conquest or religious fervor. The Gothic style emerging from his experimental reconstruction would spread across Europe like a revelation, creating structures that seemed to defy the very laws of physics in their quest to touch heaven itself. But the Gothic cathedral was merely the most visible expression of a broader transformation sweeping through European civilization. Between 1100 and 1250, medieval Europe experienced an intellectual and cultural renaissance that rivaled any flowering in human history. Universities emerged to challenge the monopoly of monastic learning. Scholars rediscovered Aristotle and attempted to reconcile Greek philosophy with Christian faith. Artists and architects pushed the boundaries of their crafts to create works of unprecedented beauty and complexity. This was the Europe of Thomas Aquinas and Peter Abelard, of Chartres Cathedral and the University of Paris, of courtly love and vernacular literature. A civilization that had learned not merely to survive but to aspire to reach beyond the practical demands of feudal society toward ideals of beauty, truth, and transcendence that would define the Western intellectual tradition for centuries to come. The revolution began in the schools. For centuries, education had been confined largely to monasteries, where monks copied manuscripts and preserved classical learning primarily for devotional purposes. The cathedral schools that emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries represented something entirely new, institutions devoted to learning for its own sake, where masters and students gathered to debate questions that had nothing to do with immediate practical needs. The school of Chartres epitomized this new intellectual spirit. Under masters like Bernard and Thierry of Chartres, students studied not just scripture and theology, but grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, the full curriculum of the 7 liberal arts that had been preserved from antiquity. More importantly, they learned to question, to debate, to apply reason to the most fundamental problems of existence. Bernard of Chartres captured the spirit of this enterprise in words that have echoed through intellectual history. We are like dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. We see more in things that are more distant than they did, not because our sight is superior or because we are taller than they, but because they lift us up and by their great stature add to ours. This humble confidence, the conviction that moderns could build upon ancient wisdom rather than merely preserve it, marked a revolutionary shift in European intellectual life. For the first time since the fall of Rome, European scholars believed they could surpass their predecessors, not through divine revelation, but through human reason and investigation. The catalyst for this intellectual revolution was the rediscovery of Aristotle through Arabic translations and commentaries. The works of the philosopher, as medieval scholars called him, had been largely unknown in Western Europe since the 6th century. Now, through the translation schools of Spain and Sicily, they poured into European consciousness like water into a drought-stricken land. The impact was immediate and explosive. Here was a systematic philosophy that addressed every aspect of existence, logic, ethics, politics, natural science, metaphysics with a rigor and comprehensiveness that Christian thinkers had never encountered. Aristotle's method of rational inquiry, his belief that truth could be discovered through observation and logical analysis, challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between faith and reason. The challenge was both intellectual and institutional. If Aristotle was right that human reason could discover truth independently of divine revelation, what role remained for Scripture and church authority? If his natural philosophy could explain the physical world without reference to Christian doctrine, how could theological claims about creation and divine providence be maintained? These questions came to a head in the emergence of the universities, perhaps medieval Europe's most distinctive institutional innovation. Unlike the monastery schools with their emphasis on spiritual formation or the cathedral schools with their focus on practical clerical training, the universities were devoted entirely to the pursuit of knowledge through disputation, formal academic debate governed by strict logical rules. The University of Bologna, founded in the late 11th century, pioneered the systematic study of Roman law, creating the legal scholarship that would enable medieval monarchies to challenge feudal fragmentation. The University of Paris, emerging from the Cathedral School of Notre Dame around 1200, became the acknowledged center of theological education in Western Europe. Oxford and Cambridge followed in England, Salamanca in Spain, Naples in Sicily. By 1250, universities were transforming intellectual life across the continent. The university represented something unprecedented in human history, a community devoted entirely to learning, where masters and students from across Europe gathered to debate the most fundamental questions of existence. The democratic elements were remarkable. Students elected their own rectors, formed nations based on geographical origin, and possessed collective bargaining power against both ecclesiastical and secular authorities. The curriculum reflected the new confidence in human reason. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic provided the tools for analysis and argument. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music revealed the mathematical harmonies underlying creation. The higher faculties of law, medicine, and theology applied these methods to professional knowledge, creating specialized expertise that would gradually replace the generalist learning of earlier centuries. Yet the most profound intellectual achievement of this period was the synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology accomplished by Thomas Aquinas. Born into the Italian nobility around 1225, Thomas abandoned a comfortable secular career to join the revolutionary New Dominican Order, dedicating his life to the proposition that reason and faith, properly understood, could never contradict each other. The Summa Theologica that Thomas composed between 1265 and 1273 represented the culmination of medieval scholastic method. Using Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, Thomas constructed a systematic account of Christian doctrine that addressed every possible objection with rigorous philosophical argument. His famous 5 ways of proving God's existence demonstrated that reason alone, without reference to scripture or tradition, could establish the fundamental truths of Christianity. Thomas's achievement was to show that the new learning from the Islamic world, far from threatening Christian faith, could actually strengthen and clarify it. Aristotelian philosophy provided the intellectual tools necessary to understand divine revelation more completely. Natural reason and supernatural faith were different paths to the same truth. The truth about God and His creation that was the proper object of all human inquiry. This intellectual synthesis found its perfect architectural expression in the Gothic cathedral. The style that emerged at St. Denis around 1140 represented more than aesthetic innovation. It was a theological statement rendered in stone and glass, a systematic attempt to create sacred space that embodied the highest achievements of medieval philosophy and engineering. The Gothic masters, for they were masters in the most literal sense, members of craft guilds, jealously guarding their professional secrets, solved engineering problems that had puzzled builders for centuries. The pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic architecture, distributed weight more efficiently than the Roman semicircular arch. The flying buttress channeled the outward thrust of stone vaults to external supports, allowing walls to be pierced with enormous windows. The ribbed vault created a skeletal framework that could support tremendous weights while maintaining structural flexibility, but technique served vision. The Gothic cathedral sought to dematerialize architecture, to create the impression that these massive stone structures were weightless, transparent, ascending naturally toward heaven. The walls dissolved into glass, creating interiors flooded with colored light that transformed the architectural space into something approaching the celestial Jerusalem described in Revelation. The Cathedral of Chartres, rebuilt after the fire of 1194, achieved this vision with unprecedented completeness. The west facade, with its three great portals depicting the life of Christ, created a theological program in sculpture that rivaled any manuscript illumination. The interior, with its soaring naive and ethereal light, induced a psychological state that contemporaries described as approaching mystical experience. The 1716 glass windows told the entire story of salvation history in images that could be read by the illiterate while conveying theological subtleties that challenged the most learned scholars. These windows represented one of the Gothic age's greatest artistic achievements. The masters of stained glass had learned to manipulate colored light with a sophistication that would not be matched until the modern era. Blue glass from St. Denis became the standard for royal magnificence. The roses of Chartres created mandala-like patterns that suggested the cosmic order underlying apparent chaos. The narrative windows told stories with a complexity and emotional power that rivaled the greatest literature of the age. The construction of these cathedrals required unprecedented social cooperation. Entire communities committed themselves to projects that would take generations to complete, understanding that they were participating in something transcendent. The guilds of masons, carpenters, glaziers, and sculptors developed techniques and artistic vocabularies that spread across Europe through networks of professional craftsmen. Kings and bishops, merchants and peasants all contributed, according to their abilities to enterprises that embodied their civilization's highest aspirations. The Gothic cathedral also reflected the urban revival that was transforming European society. These were not monastery churches built for the contemplation of a few monks, but civic buildings designed to accommodate entire urban populations. The great cathedrals of Paris, Reims, Amiens, and Cologne were statements of civic pride as much as religious devotion, demonstrations that the emerging towns could rival the castles of feudal lords in their ability to inspire awe and command allegiance. This urban renaissance was transforming European culture in ways that extended far beyond architecture. The troubadours of southern France, the Menacingers of Germany, and the courtly poets of northern France created a new literature that celebrated secular love with an intensity and sophistication previously reserved for divine worship. The chanson de geste gave way to romance, the heroic warrior to the courtly lover, violence to refinement. The Cultural Revolution was perhaps most visible in the emergence of vernacular literature. Whereas Latin had been the exclusive language of learning and sophisticated culture, the 12th and 13th centuries witnessed the flowering of poetry and prose in the spoken languages of Europe. The matter of France celebrating Charlemagne and his paladins, the matter of Britain exploring the Arthurian legends, and the matter of antiquity retelling classical stories for medieval audiences all demonstrated that vernacular languages could achieve effects as sublime as Latin. Cratine d'Etretat's Arthurian romances created a new literary form that would influence European culture for centuries. His knights were not merely warriors, but lovers, philosophers, and spiritual seekers whose adventures in the physical world paralleled journeys of psychological and religious discovery. The Grail legend that emerged from this tradition transformed the quest for a physical object into a metaphor for spiritual perfection. This literature reflected and reinforced the transformation of knightly culture that was occurring throughout Europe. The chivalric ideal that emerged in the 12th century combined martial prowess with courtesy, loyalty with refinement, service to lord with devotion to lady. The knight was no longer merely a professional soldier, but a cultural ideal embodying the highest values of medieval civilization. The code of chivalry, never formally written but universally understood, required knights to protect the church, defend the weak, show courtesy to women, and maintain loyalty to legitimate superiors. The tournament, originally a form of military training, became an elaborate social ritual where knights could display not only martial skill but cultural sophistication. The cult of courtly love transformed relationships between men and women into spiritualized quests for perfection. Yet this cultural flowering occurred against a background of unprecedented economic growth and social change. The agricultural revolution of the High Middle Ages, based on the three-field system, improved plowing techniques, and the use of horses rather than oxen, had increased food production dramatically. Population was growing rapidly, new lands were being brought under cultivation, and urban centers were experiencing explosive growth. The commercial revolution that accompanied this demographic expansion created new forms of wealth and new social relationships. Italian merchants developed banking techniques that enabled international trade on an unprecedented scale. The fairs of Champagne became international marketplaces where goods from Asia, Africa, and America were exchanged for European manufactured products. The Hanseatic League united German and Scandinavian cities in a commercial confederation that dominated Baltic trade. This economic transformation required new intellectual tools. The universities began offering training in practical mathematics, commercial law, and administrative techniques. Scholars developed accounting methods that enabled merchants to track complex international transactions. Legal theorists created frameworks for governing trade relationships between parties from different kingdoms and legal traditions. The mendicant orders that emerged in the early 13th century, the Franciscans and Dominicans, represented the Church's response to these social changes. Unlike the traditional monastic orders that withdrew from the world to pursue contemplative perfection, the friars embraced urban life and dedicated themselves to preaching, teaching, and ministering to populations that were increasingly mobile, sophisticated, and demanding. Francis of Assisi, the merchant's son who renounced his inheritance to embrace lady poverty, created a new model of Christian sanctity perfectly adapted to an age of commercial prosperity. His emphasis on evangelical simplicity, care for the poor, and harmony with the natural world provided a moral critique of materialism without rejecting the legitimate pursuits of urban civilization. Dominic of Guzman, responding to the challenge of heretical movements that appealed to educated laypeople, created an order specifically devoted to preaching and theological education. The Dominican emphasis on intellectual preparation and doctrinal sophistication enabled the Church to compete effectively with heterodox teachers while maintaining orthodox positions. The mendicant orders revolutionized medieval education by bringing university training into the service of pastoral care. Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, as were Albertus Magnus and Meister Eckhart. The Franciscans produced equally distinguished scholars, including Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and Roger Bacon. These religious intellectuals combined the highest levels of philosophical sophistication with practical concern for the spiritual welfare of ordinary Christians. By 1250, medieval Europe had achieved a cultural synthesis of remarkable completeness and sophistication. The Gothic cathedrals rising in every major city embodied architectural and engineering techniques that would not be surpassed for centuries. The universities had created an intellectual culture that combined rigorous philosophical method with encyclopedic learning. The vernacular literatures had developed forms of artistic expression that rivaled the greatest achievements of classical antiquity. Yet, this achievement was built on tensions that would ultimately prove destructive. The synthesis of faith and reason accomplished by Thomas Aquinas, however impressive intellectually, remained vulnerable to philosophical attack. The economic prosperity that funded cathedral construction also generated new forms of inequality and social conflict. The cultural refinement of courtly civilization coexisted with levels of violence that seem incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. Most ominously, the institutional church that had provided intellectual and spiritual leadership throughout the High Middle Ages was becoming increasingly worldly and bureaucratic. The papal monarchy that had successfully challenged imperial authority was growing more concerned with temporal power than spiritual guidance. The mendicant ideals of evangelical poverty were being compromised by the acquisition of vast properties and endowments. As the 13th century progressed, these tensions would become increasingly apparent. The confidence that had created the Gothic cathedrals and scholastic syntheses would give way to doubt and anxiety. The demographic growth that had sustained the high medieval Renaissance would be checked by famine and disease. The political unity that had enabled the Crusades would fragment into competing nationalisms. The greatest achievements of medieval civilization had been accomplished. What remained was to see whether they could survive the challenges that success itself had created. On a meadow beside the Thames, in the shadow of Windsor Castle, King John of England pressed his seal into warm wax on June 15, 1215, and in that moment forever altered the relationship between ruler and ruled in the Western world. The parchment beneath his trembling hand was Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and its 63 clauses represented something unprecedented in European history, a formal limitation of royal power, imposed by armed rebellion and sanctified by law. When John agreed that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land, he was acknowledging a principle that would echo through the centuries, from the English Civil War to the American Revolution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Yet Magna Carta was more than a constitutional milestone. It was a symptom of the broader transformation sweeping through European politics. The loose personal bonds of early feudalism were giving way to more sophisticated forms of government. Royal administrators were challenging baronial independence. Professional bureaucrats were replacing warrior nobles in positions of authority. The very nature of kingship was being redefined by monarchs who dreamed not of feudal lordship but of sovereign power. This revolution in governance was playing out simultaneously across the continent, but nowhere more dramatically than in the three great powers that would dominate European politics for centuries to come: England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Each would follow a different path towards centralized authority, each would face unique obstacles, and each would leave an indelible mark on the development of the modern state. The English transformation began with Henry II, who ascended the throne in 1154 with an inheritance that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The Angevin Empire that Henry ruled was a patchwork of territories bound together only by his personal authority. England conquered by his great-grandfather William, Normandy inherited from his mother, Anjou from his father Aquitaine through his marriage to Eleanor. It was an empire built on dynasticism rather than nationalism, on feudal accident rather than natural unity. Henry's genius lay in recognizing that such an unwieldy confederation could be governed only through systematic administrative innovation. Working with brilliant advisors like Thomas Becket, he created institutions that would outlast any individual ruler in function, regardless of personal relationships or feudal loyalties. The judicial reforms Henry implemented transformed English law from a collection of local customs into a unified system administered by royal officials. The circuit judges who traveled throughout the realm carried with them not just royal authority but standardized procedures that gradually created what lawyers called common law that was common to all free Englishmen, regardless of their local origins or feudal status. The implications were revolutionary. For the first time since the Roman Empire, ordinary people could appeal to universal legal principles that transcended the arbitrary will of local lords. The writs that Henry's chancellery produced, standardized legal documents that initiated court proceedings, made royal justice accessible to anyone who could pay the modest fees involved. The jury system that emerged from Anglo-Saxon traditions was refined and systematized, creating a method of determining facts that seemed more reliable than the ordeal by fire or combat that had previously characterized medieval justice. Yet Henry's greatest administrative innovation may have been the exchequer, the royal treasury that evolved into Europe's most sophisticated financial bureaucracy. The pipe rolls that recorded royal revenues and expenditures provided an unprecedented level of fiscal control, enabling the monarchy to predict income, plan expenditures, and hold local officials accountable for their financial administration. This bureaucratic revolution inevitably produced conflict with traditional authorities. The confrontation with Thomas Becket, who had transformed from royal chancellor into defender of ecclesiastical privilege, symbolized the broader struggle between royal administrative authority and established feudal and clerical immunities. When Henry's exasperated outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" led to Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, the king discovered that even the most sophisticated governmental machinery could not entirely escape the personal violent character of medieval politics. Henry's sons inherited his administrative innovations but lacked his political judgment. Richard I spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, treating his kingdom as a source of revenue for his crusading adventures rather than a realm to be governed. John's loss of Normandy, Anjou, and most other French territories to Philip Augustus represented not just military defeat, but the failure of the personal dynastic approach to empire building that had characterized early kingship. John's domestic difficulties stemmed largely from his attempts to finance the recovery of his French territories through unprecedented taxation and administrative centralization. The barons who forced him to accept Magna Carta were not opposing royal government in principle, but demanding that it operate within legal constraints that protected their traditional rights and privileges. The charter they imposed was both conservative and revolutionary. Conservative in its defense of established feudal liberties, revolutionary in its assertion that even kings were subject to law. The famous Clause 39, guaranteeing legal due process, would be cited by English lawyers for centuries as the foundation of constitutional government. The equally important Clause 12, restricting the king's right to levy taxes without baronial consent, established the principle that would eventually lead to parliamentary control over royal finances. Magna Carta's long-term significance lay not in its immediate provisions but in its establishment of constitutional monarchy as an English tradition. Future kings might ignore or circumvent the Charter's specific clauses, but they could never entirely escape the precedent that royal power was legally limited and that subjects possessed rights that even monarchs were bound to respect. While England was developing constitutional limitations on royal authority, France was pursuing the opposite path toward absolute monarchy. The Capetian dynasty that had ruled France since 987 had spent its first century merely trying to control the Isle de France around Paris. By 1200, however, the monarchy had begun the systematic expansion that would make France Europe's most powerful kingdom. Philip Augustus, who ruled from 1180 to 1223, was the architect of French royal resurgence. Unlike his English contemporary Richard the Lionheart, Philip understood that effective kingship required patient attention to administrative detail rather than spectacular military adventures. His great achievement was not any single victory but the methodical expansion of royal authority at the expense of his feudal vassals. The conquest of Normandy from John in 1204 demonstrated Philip's strategic brilliance. Rather than attempting direct military confrontation, he systematically undermined John's position by supporting his rebellious barons, exploiting legal technicalities, and gradually isolating the English king from his continental allies. When military action finally became necessary, Philip was prepared with superior resources and clearer strategic objectives. More importantly, Philip's administrative innovations enabled the monarchy to govern its expanded territories effectively. The royal domain that had been confined to the Paris region was extended to include most of northern France through a combination of conquest, marriage, and eschatol. The Bellias and Senecacs, who administered these territories on behalf of the crown, created a professional bureaucracy that owed its authority entirely to royal appointment rather than feudal inheritance. The financial innovations of Philip's reign were equally significant. The royal revenues that had been largely confined to the traditional feudal payments of the original Capetian domain were supplemented by new forms of taxation that reflected the crown's expanding authority. The Odoacer, extraordinary taxes levied for specific purposes like crusading or royal marriages, established precedents for regular taxation that would eventually make the French monarchy financially independent of feudal obligations. Philip's successors built systematically on these foundations. Louis VIII's conquest of most of the Albigensian lands in southern France brought the crown its first major expansion beyond the traditional boundaries of the Frankish kingdom. Louis IX's St. Louis combined military success with administrative innovation to create the institutional framework that would support French royal power for centuries. The Parliament of Paris that emerged during Louis IX's reign represented a new form of royal justice that transcended local jurisdictions and feudal privileges. Unlike the English Parliament, which developed as an assembly that limited royal authority, the French Parliament was a royal court that extended monarchical power by providing appeals from local jurisdictions. The professional lawyers who staffed this institution owed their authority entirely to royal appointment and dedicated themselves to expanding royal jurisdiction at the expense of feudal and ecclesiastical courts. Louis IX's moral authority. He was canonized as a saint within 30 years of his death, provided crucial legitimacy for this expansion of royal power. His reputation for justice, piety, and personal holiness enabled the monarchy to present itself as the defender of divine order against feudal anarchy. The ideal of sacred kingship that Louis embodied would remain central to French royal ideology until the Revolution of 1789. The reign of Philip IV, Philip the Fair, marked the culmination of Capetian centralization and the beginning of conflicts that would dominate European politics for centuries. Philip's expansion of royal authority brought him into direct confrontation with the two great international powers of medieval Europe, the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. The conflict with Pope Boniface VIII over the taxation of clergy revealed how far French royal authority had advanced since the days of Henry IV's submission at Canossa. When Boniface issued the Bull Unam Sanctum, claiming papal supremacy over all temporal rulers, Philip responded by sending agents to kidnap the Pope at Anagni. The shocking humiliation of the papal office, the slap of Anagni, demonstrated that even the most exalted spiritual authority could not effectively resist a determined and well-organized secular government. Philip's destruction of the Knights Templar provided an even more dramatic example of royal power unchecked by legal or moral constraints. The arrest of all Templars in France on Friday, October 13, 1307, was carried out with military precision that would have been impossible without the administrative innovations of the preceding century. The confiscation of Templar wealth provided Philip with the resources necessary to finance his ambitious foreign policies while eliminating an international organization that had possessed dangerous independence from royal authority. The ecclesiastical crisis that followed, the Babylonian captivity of the papacy at Avignon from 1309 to 1377, resulted directly from French royal pressure and marked the effective end of papal claims to temporal supremacy over secular rulers. The popes who resided at Avignon were not formal prisoners, but their dependence on French protection made them instruments of French policy rather than independent arbiters of international disputes. While England developed constitutional monarchy and France pursued absolute monarchy, the Holy Roman Empire attempted something far more ambitious and ultimately impossible: the creation of a universal Christian monarchy that would unite all of Europe under a single crown. The dream of restored Roman Empire had never entirely disappeared since Charlemagne's coronation in 800. Otto I's revival of the imperial title in 962 represented the first systematic attempt to realize this vision. But the Ettonian, Salian, and early Hohenstaufen emperors had been forced to devote most of their attention to German affairs rather than universal monarchy. Frederick Barbarossa, who became emperor in 1152, was the first ruler with the resources and vision necessary to attempt genuine imperial hegemony over Western Europe. His Italian campaigns represented more than feudal expansion. They were systematic efforts to assert imperial authority over the papacy, the Byzantine Empire, and the emerging national monarchies that threatened German predominance. The conflict with the Lombard League demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of imperial policy. Frederick's victories at Legnano in 1176 showed that imperial armies could defeat even the most sophisticated opposition when properly led and adequately supplied. His subsequent diplomatic settlement with Alexander III revealed equally impressive political flexibility. The emperor was prepared to compromise with enemies when military victory proved impossible or excessively costly. Yet the Italian obsession that consumed Frederick and his successors ultimately proved destructive to German unity and imperial effectiveness. The resources devoted to Italian campaigns could have been used to consolidate royal authority within Germany itself, where feudal fragmentation was becoming increasingly problematic. The long absences of emperors pursuing Italian ambitions enabled German princes to establish regional autonomies that would eventually make effective imperial government impossible. Frederick II represented both the zenith and the nadir of medieval imperial ambition. Raised in Sicily as the ward of Pope Innocent III, educated in Arabic as well as Latin, familiar with Islamic and Byzantine political traditions as well as Western feudalism, Frederick embodied the cosmopolitan ideal that had always been implicit in the imperial title. His intellectual achievements were remarkable by any standard. The court at Palermo became a center of learning that rivaled Paris or Oxford. Frederick's own scientific writings, particularly his treatise on falconry, demonstrated observational methods that anticipated the experimental approach of later centuries. His legal code for Sicily, the Constitutions of Melfi, created administrative institutions that were centuries ahead of their time in their systematic rationality and bureaucratic sophistication. Yet Frederick's very brilliance made him dangerous to the established order of medieval Europe. His willingness to negotiate with Muslim rulers as equals horrified traditionalists who expected Christian emperors to treat Islam as an existential enemy. His scientific interests suggested heterodox religious views that scandalized Orthodox theologians. His administrative innovations threatened established privileges and traditional authorities throughout the empire. The conflict with Pope Gregory IX and his successors was therefore inevitable. When Gregory declared Frederick deposed and preached a crusade against him, the confrontation became a struggle for the of European civilization itself. Frederick represented the ideal of rational secular government based on Roman law and administrative efficiency. The papacy represented the traditional view that all temporal authority derived from spiritual sources and remained subject to ecclesiastical supervision. Frederick's ultimate defeat was less military than demographic and financial. The resources of Sicily and Germany, however efficiently administered, could not indefinitely sustain warfare against coalitions that included France, England, the Italian communes, and the international church. The Mongol invasions that devastated Eastern Europe during Frederick's reign diverted imperial attention and resources at the crucial moment when concentrated effort might have achieved decisive victory over papal opposition. The great interregnum that followed Frederick's death in 1250 marked the effective end of universal imperial ambitions. For 23 years, no emperor was recognized throughout the empire, and when Rudolf of Habsburg finally achieved election in 1273, it was as a German king rather than a universal monarch. The Holy Roman Empire would continue to exist until 1806, but it had become a German confederation rather than a European empire. By 1300, the political map of Europe had been fundamentally transformed. The universal authorities of the High Middle Ages, emperor and pope, had been replaced by national monarchies that acknowledged no superior jurisdiction within their territories. England had pioneered constitutional government that balanced royal authority with legal limitations. France had developed administrative monarchy that concentrated unprecedented power in royal hands. Germany had fragmented into a collection of principalities that would not achieve political unity until the 19th century. These political innovations had profound cultural and social implications. The growth of royal bureaucracies created new opportunities for educated men who lacked aristocratic birth but possessed administrative skills. The development of national legal systems encouraged the growth of professional lawyers who would become increasingly important in European politics. The expansion of royal taxation required more sophisticated financial techniques that stimulated commercial development and banking innovation. Yet the triumph of national monarchy also created new sources of conflict that would dominate European politics for centuries. The territorial boundaries established through military conquest and dynastic accident bore little relationship to linguistic, cultural, or economic divisions. The English possessions in France, the German interests in Italy, the papal territories in central Italy, all of these created ongoing sources of international tension that would periodically explode into major warfare. Most ominously, the strengthening of royal authority was accompanied by the declining effectiveness of international institutions that had previously limited the scope of European conflicts. The papal mediation that had often prevented minor disputes from escalating into major wars became less effective as national monarchies grew more confident of their ability to pursue independent policies. The imperial authority that had imposed some degree of unity on Central Europe disappeared entirely, leaving a power vacuum that would periodically tempt French expansion eastward. The Europe of 1300 was more prosperous, more sophisticated, and more efficiently governed than the Europe of 1000. It was also more dangerous as the strengthened monarchies that had emerged from feudal fragmentation possessed both the motivation and the capacity for conflicts that would dwarf the localized violence of earlier centuries. The stage was set for the great catastrophes of the 14th century, the Hundred Years' War, the Black Death, the Great Schism that would test whether the political and social institutions of the High Middle Ages could survive the challenges that their own success had created. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese galleys limped into the harbor of Messina, their decks littered with the dead and dying, their surviving crew members covered in black boils that wept blood and pus. The horrified Sicilians who witnessed their arrival could not have imagined that these plague ships carried the seeds of a catastrophe that would kill 1/3 of Europe's population and shatter the confident civilization of the High Middle Ages forever. The Black Death that spread from those Sicilian ports across the entire continent represented more than demographic disaster. It was the herald of a that would witness the collapse of medieval Europe's most cherished institutions and assumptions. Between 1300, the unified Christendom that had launched the Crusades would fragment into competing national churches. The feudal bonds that had provided social stability for centuries would dissolve under economic and military pressure. The papal monarchy that had claimed authority over kings and emperors would split into rival factions, each claiming to be the true successor of St. Peter. Yet from this apparent collapse would emerge the foundations of the modern world. The crisis of the 14th century forced Europeans to develop new forms of government, new economic relationships, new ways of understanding their place in creation itself. The Europe that entered the Renaissance bore little resemblance to the medieval world that had preceded it, but the transformation had been purchased at a price in human suffering that staggers the imagination. The century of crisis began not with plague, but with famine. The medieval warm period that had sustained population growth since 1000 was ending, replaced by cooler, wetter weather that reduced agricultural yields across the continent. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 provided a grim preview of what was to come, as millions starved in the first sustained demographic catastrophe Europe had experienced in 3 centuries. Contemporary chroniclers described scenes that seemed to come from the apocalypse itself. In Flanders, desperate parents sold their children into slavery for bread. In England, criminals were released from prison because there was no food to sustain them. In France, wolves grown bold from feeding on human corpses attacked travelers on roads that had once been safe. The theological implications were as disturbing as the physical suffering. If God protected those who served him faithfully, why were Christian lands experiencing divine wrath comparable to the plagues of Egypt? The famine years revealed the fragility of the economic and social systems that had sustained medieval Europe's expansion. The agricultural techniques that had supported steady population growth for 3 centuries proved inadequate when weather patterns changed. The commercial networks that had connected distant markets collapsed when demand disappeared and transportation became impossible. The feudal obligations that had provided military service in exchange for protection proved meaningless when lords could no longer fulfill their basic duty of ensuring their vassals' survival. Recovery from the famine was slow and incomplete when an even more devastating catastrophe arrived from the east. The plague that would become known as the Black Death had originated in the steppes of Central Asia, where it was endemic among rodent populations. The Mongol trade networks that connected China to the Mediterranean inadvertently carried infected fleas westward, creating a transmission belt for pandemic disease that reached from Beijing to London. The disease itself defied medieval medical understanding. The bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis produced symptoms that seemed almost deliberately designed to inspire terror: grotesque swellings in the lymph nodes, internal bleeding that turned victims black, and death rates that approached 90% in some communities. Even more frightening were the pneumonic and septicemic variants that killed even faster and spread through human contact rather than flea bites. The Black Death entered Europe through multiple routes simultaneously. The Genoese ships that reached Messina in 1347 carried the plague from their trading posts in the Black Sea. Other infected vessels reached Marseille, Venice, and Constantinople at roughly the same time. Within 2 years, the pandemic had spread to every corner of the continent, from Sicily to Scotland, from Portugal to Poland. The mortality was unprecedented in recorded human history. In some cities, Florence, Siena, Avignon, half the population died within months. Rural areas sometimes fared even worse, with entire villages simply disappearing as their inhabitants fled or perished. The English poll tax records suggest that the kingdom's population fell from perhaps 4 million to 2.5 million. French demographic recovery would not be complete until the early 16th century. Yet the plague's social and psychological impact was even more profound than its demographic consequences. Medieval Europeans had no framework for understanding mass mortality that struck without regard for social status, moral behavior, or religious devotion. Bishops died alongside beggars, saints alongside sinners, children alongside adults. The careful hierarchies that had structured medieval society seemed meaningless in the face of indiscriminate death. The religious crisis provoked by the Black Death found its most extreme expression in the flagellant movements that swept across Europe in 1348 and 1349. Processions of penitents, sometimes numbering in the thousands, wandered from town to town, whipping themselves in public ceremonies designed to appease divine wrath. Their songs and sermons proclaimed that the plague was God's punishment for human sin, that only the most extreme forms of penance could turn aside the celestial anger that threatened to destroy all of Christendom. The flagellants represented something unprecedented in medieval religious culture. Popular religious movements that operated entirely outside ecclesiastical authority. Their leaders claimed direct divine inspiration. Their rituals bypassed sacramental mediation. Their theology challenged fundamental assumptions about salvation and divine justice. When the movement began to turn violently anti-clerical and anti-Semitic, attacking priests and massacring Jewish communities, the Church finally moved to suppress it. The pogroms that accompanied the Black Death revealed the dark undercurrents of medieval Christian society. Jewish communities, already marginalized and vulnerable, became scapegoats for disasters that no one understood. From the Rhine Valley to Eastern Europe, entire Jewish populations were burned alive by mobs, convinced that they had poisoned wells or otherwise caused the plague. The financial debts that Christian merchants and nobles owed to Jewish moneylenders provided additional motivation for violence that was justified in religious terms. The demographic catastrophe fundamentally altered European economic and social relationships. The sudden scarcity of labor that resulted from mass mortality gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. The manorial system that had bound rural workers to the land for centuries began to collapse as lords competed for scarce agricultural labor. Serfdom, which had been strengthening in Eastern Europe, began to weaken in the West as lords offered freedom and higher wages to attract workers. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 demonstrated how completely the plague had transformed social relationships. When the government attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and collect new taxes to finance foreign wars, rural and urban workers united in the most serious popular uprising in English history. The rebels who marched on London under Wat Tyler's leadership demanded not just economic concessions but fundamental changes in social organization. The abolition of serfdom, the elimination of privilege based on birth, equality before the law for all free Englishmen. The revolt's violent suppression. Tyler was murdered during negotiations with the young King Richard II, did not restore the old social order. The economic forces unleashed by demographic catastrophe proved stronger than royal legislation or aristocratic resistance. By 1400, English serfdom was effectively dead, replaced by relationships based on money, rent rather than labor service. The transformation took longer in other parts of Europe, but the underlying dynamic was the same everywhere. Traditional bonds of personal dependence were giving way to contractual relationships based on market forces. While Europe struggled to recover from demographic catastrophe, it was simultaneously torn apart by the longest and most destructive war in medieval history. The 100 Years' War between England and France, lasting from 1337 to 1453, began as a dynastic dispute but evolved into something far more significant, the first modern war between emerging nation-states. The immediate cause was the death of Charles IV in 1328 without male heirs. Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through his mother, claimed the French throne against Philip VI, who was only Charles's cousin but undeniably male and French. The legal issues were complex, but the underlying problem was simpler. The English monarchy still controlled substantial French territories. Gascony, Poitou, the Channel Islands, that made it impossible for France to achieve the territorial unity that successful royal government required. The early phases of the war seemed to vindicate English military superiority. The battles of Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 demonstrated that English longbowmen could destroy French heavy cavalry through massed archery fire. The capture of King John II at Poitiers was a humiliation from which French royal prestige never entirely recovered. The Treaty of Bretigny in 1360 left Edward III in control of roughly one-third of France in full sovereignty, a territorial concession that no French monarch could permanently accept. Yet English military success concealed fundamental strategic weaknesses. The territories that England controlled were either coastal enclaves, dependent on naval communications, or inland regions surrounded by hostile French populations. The English armies that won spectacular victories were too small to garrison the territories they conquered, too expensive to maintain indefinitely, and too dependent on individual military genius to survive changes in leadership. The French recovery under Charles V demonstrated the advantages of patient systematic warfare over spectacular but unsustainable military adventures. Rather than seeking decisive battles that might be lost catastrophically, Charles and his constable Bertrand de Gascogne adopted a strategy of gradual reconquest that avoided major engagements while steadily reducing English strongholds through siege warfare and guerrilla tactics. The transformation of military technology during the Hundred Years' War had implications that extended far beyond the specific Anglo-French conflict. The English longbow, capable of penetrating mail armor at ranges up to 200 yards, made traditional heavy cavalry charges suicidal. The early artillery used at Crécy and later conflicts, while militarily insignificant in the 14th century, pointed toward technological developments that would eventually make castle fortifications obsolete. More importantly, the financial demands of prolonged warfare forced both monarchies to develop new relationships with their subjects based on consent rather than obligation. The English Parliament's control over taxation, established during Edward III's reign, created constitutional precedents that would eventually limit royal authority fundamentally. The French Estates General, summoned repeatedly to approve new taxes, developed institutional procedures that might have led to similar limitations on monarchical power if political circumstances had been different. The war's social consequences were equally profound. The destruction of the French countryside, systematically ravaged by English armies pursuing a strategy of economic warfare, reduced large regions to wasteland. The routiers and écorcheurs, mercenary companies that continued fighting for plunder when official campaigns ended, brought the violence of international war into local communities that had no involvement in the dynastic disputes that theoretically justified the destruction of their property and lives. The military revolution precipitated by the Hundred Years' War accelerated social changes that the Black Death had initiated. Traditional feudal military service, based on knights equipped at their own expense for brief campaigns, proved inadequate for wars that lasted decades and required sustained professional competence. The professional soldiers who replaced feudal levies owed loyalty to whoever paid their wages rather than to feudal superiors who could no longer provide effective military leadership. While England and France exhausted themselves in territorial warfare, the Catholic Church was simultaneously destroying its own unity and moral authority through the crisis known as the Great Schism. The papacy that had claimed authority over all temporal rulers in the High Middle Ages split into rival factions, each claiming to be the legitimate successor of St. Peter, each excommunicating the supporters of its competitors. The crisis began with the return of papacy from Avignon to Rome in 1377, ending the Babylonian captivity that had subjected the papal office to French influence for nearly 70 years. Gregory XI's decision to restore the papal residence to its traditional location was popular among Romans and Italian Christians generally, but it created institutional problems that proved insoluble within existing canonical frameworks. The Roman cardinals who elected Urban VI in 1378 expected to choose a pope who would be grateful for their support and amenable to their advice. Instead, they found themselves confronting a reformer determined to eliminate the corruption and worldliness that had characterized the Avignon papacy. Urban's harsh criticism of ecclesiastical abuses alienated the very cardinals who had elected him, leading them to declare his election invalid and choose a rival pope. The result was unprecedented in Christian history, two men simultaneously claiming to be the legitimate pope, each with substantial support among European Christians, each exercising apparent spiritual authority within their respective territories. Clement VII, based at Avignon, received recognition from France, Spain, and Scotland. Urban VI, residing in Rome, was acknowledged by England, Germany, and most of Italy. The geographical division reflected political loyalties more than theological convictions. Christians supported whichever papal claimant was recognized by their secular rulers. The canonical problem was insoluble because medieval church law provided no mechanism for resolving disputes between rival papal claimants when both had been elected according to proper procedures. Each pope excommunicated the supporters of his rival, creating the absurd situation where devout Christians were necessarily schismatic according to one or the other papal authority. The spiritual unity that had been the Church's greatest achievement since Constantine was shattered by institutional conflicts that seemed to have no resolution within existing legal frameworks. The conciliar movement that emerged in response to this crisis represented the most serious challenge to papal monarchy in Christian history. University theologians, drawing on Aristotelian political theory and canon law precedents, argued that the Church was a corporation in which ultimate authority resided in the community of believers rather than in any individual officeholder. General councils, representing the entire Church, possessed authority superior to that of any pope and could depose papal claimants who had forfeited their spiritual authority through schismatic behavior. The Council of Pisa in 1409 attempted to resolve the schism by deposing both existing papal claimants and electing a new pope acceptable to all Christians. Instead of ending the crisis, however, Pisa created a third papal line as neither of the deposed popes accepted conciliar authority. The spectacle of three simultaneous papal claimants, each excommunicating the others, reduced the papal office to such contempt that even devout Christians began to question whether the institutional church was necessary for salvation. The Council of Constance, meeting from 1414 to 18, finally resolved the Great Schism through a combination of political compromise and canonical innovation. The council deposed all three papal claimants and elected Martin V as the universally recognized pope. More importantly, it promulgated the Decree Sacrosancta, which declared that general councils possessed authority superior to that of any pope and could be convened without papal permission to address ecclesiastical crises. Yet the papacy's victory over conciliarism was ultimately decisive. The popes who succeeded Martin V systematically undermined conciliar authority, while rebuilding the papal monarchy on foundations that would prove more durable than the medieval system that had collapsed during the Great Schism. The Renaissance papacy that emerged from this crisis would be more worldly, more politically sophisticated, and more artistically magnificent than its medieval predecessor, but also more vulnerable to theological challenge by reformers who questioned its spiritual legitimacy. The cumulative impact of plague, war, and schism had transformed European civilization beyond recognition. The demographic catastrophe of the Black Death had broken the manorial system and created new social relationships based on economic competition rather than traditional hierarchy. The military revolution of the 100 Years' War had made feudal military service obsolete while demonstrating the advantages of professional armies accountable to centralized governments. The ecclesiastical crisis of the Great Schism had destroyed the medieval ideal of unified Christendom while creating space for new forms of religious expression. By 1400, the confident medieval synthesis that had created the Gothic cathedrals and scholastic philosophy was clearly ending. The intellectual certainties that had enabled Thomas Aquinas to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology were being questioned by nominalist philosophers who doubted whether human reason could achieve reliable knowledge about God or creation. The social hierarchies that had seemed divinely ordained were being challenged by popular movements that demanded equality before the law and participation in political decision-making. Yet the crisis of the 14th century was also creative, forcing Europeans to develop institutions and ideas that would provide the foundation for the modern world. The representative assemblies that emerged from the financial demands of prolonged warfare would eventually evolve into democratic governments. The professional armies that replaced feudal levies would become the instrument through which centralized states imposed their authority over local jurisdictions. The vernacular literatures that flourished during this period of institutional collapse would provide the cultural foundation for emerging national identities. Most importantly, the human suffering of the 14th century generated new forms of religious expression that emphasized personal salvation rather than institutional mediation. The mystical movements that flourished during and after the Black Death, the Devotio Moderna in the Netherlands, the Brethren of the Common Life in Germany, the Lollards in England, all stressed direct relationship between the individual believer and God, bypassing the ecclesiastical hierarchy that had lost credibility during the Great Schism. The Europe that emerged from the crisis of the 14th century was more dangerous and more dynamic than the medieval world that had preceded it. The strengthened monarchies that survived the plague and wars possessed both the motivation and the capability for conflicts that would dwarf the localized violence of earlier centuries. The religious divisions that had been papered over by the resolution of the Great Schism would explode into the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. The economic relationships that had emerged from demographic catastrophe would provide the foundation for commercial capitalism. As the 14th century ended, Europeans could look back on 100 years of unprecedented disaster, but also forward to unprecedented opportunity. The medieval world was dead, but from its ruins was emerging something entirely new. The foundations of the modern European state system, the Renaissance cultural flowering, and the global expansion that would make Europe the dominant civilization on Earth. The age of crisis was ending. The age of transformation was about to begin. On May 29, 1453, as the great bronze cannons of Mevn II hurled their massive stones against the ancient walls of Constantinople, the last emperor of Byzantium died fighting on the ramparts with a sword in his hand and the purple of Caesar upon his shoulders. Constantine XI Palaiologos had ruled an empire that existed more in memory than reality. A few square miles around the imperial capital, some scattered islands in the Aegean, a handful of fortresses in the Peloponnese. Yet when Turkish scimitars finally silenced his voice in the breach of the Theodosian Wall, they ended not just a dynasty but an idea that had endured for over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire itself, in its final Eastern incarnation, breathed its last. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves through European Christendom that would reverberate for centuries. Here was the city that had preserved Roman law through the Dark Ages, that had kept Greek learning alive through the medieval centuries, that had served as the eastern bastion of Christianity against Islamic expansion. Its capture by the Ottoman Turks marked not just the end of the Byzantine Empire but the closing of an entire age, the definitive transition from the medieval world to something unmistakably modern. Yet by 1453, this transformation was already well advanced across Western Europe. The crisis of the 14th century had shattered the institutional frameworks of medieval civilization, but from the ruins had emerged new forms of government, new ways of understanding humanity's place in creation, new artistic and intellectual achievements that would define European culture for centuries to come. The Renaissance that was beginning to flower in 15th century Italy represented more than cultural revival. It was a fundamental reimagining of human possibility. Where medieval thinkers had emphasized humanity's fallen nature and dependence on divine grace, Renaissance humanists celebrated human dignity and creative potential. Where medieval artists had sought to transcend the physical world through symbolic representation, Renaissance masters explored the beauty and complexity of material reality through unprecedented technical innovation. This transformation was most visible in the Italian city-states that had emerged as Europe's most dynamic political and cultural centers. The wealth generated by Mediterranean trade had enabled cities like Florence, Venice, and Milan to develop new forms of government based on commercial rather than feudal principles. The civic humanism that flourished in these urban republics created intellectual frameworks that would eventually challenge the hierarchical assumptions underlying medieval society. Florence under the Medici exemplified this new urban civilization. The banking fortune that Cosimo de' Medici had inherited from his father Giovanni enabled him to become the de facto ruler of the Florentine Republic while maintaining the fiction of republican government. His patronage of scholars, artists, and architects transformed Florence into the intellectual capital of Europe, attracting humanists like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, artists like Donatello and Brunelleschi, writers like Angelo Poliziano and Luigi Palsi. The Platonic Academy that Cosimo established at his villa outside Florence represented something unprecedented in medieval intellectual life, a community of scholars devoted to recovering and reinterpreting classical learning, not for theological purposes but for its own sake. The humanists who gathered there were not primarily clerics but lay intellectuals who believed that classical literature and philosophy could provide guidance for contemporary political and moral problems. This enthusiasm for classical antiquity reflected deeper changes in European intellectual culture. The scholastic philosophy that had dominated medieval universities was increasingly challenged by humanist scholars who preferred historical and philological study to logical analysis. The discovery of previously unknown classical texts, Tacitus's Germania, Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria, numerous Greek works previously known only through Arabic translations, provided new models for literary expression and political thought. The invention of printing with movable type around 1450 accelerated this intellectual transformation by making books cheaper and more widely available than ever before. Johannes Gutenberg's Bible, completed around 1455, demonstrated the new technology's potential for reproducing texts with unprecedented accuracy and efficiency. Within 50 years, printing presses were operating in every major European city, producing not just religious works but classical authors, vernacular literature, and practical manuals that would have been impossibly expensive to reproduce through manuscript copying. The printing revolution had implications that extended far beyond intellectual culture. The standardization of texts that printing made possible encouraged the development of vernacular languages into sophisticated literary instruments. The availability of identical copies of the same work enabled scholarly communities to develop across geographical boundaries. Most importantly, the democratization of knowledge that printing represented would eventually challenge all forms of authority based on the control of information. Yet the Renaissance was not merely an intellectual movement but a comprehensive cultural transformation that affected every aspect of European life. The artistic achievements of 15th century Italy established new standards of technical excellence and aesthetic sophistication that would influence European culture for centuries. Brunelleschi's dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, represented both an engineering triumph and an aesthetic revolution. The mathematical precision required to construct such a massive structure without external buttressing demonstrated that classical architectural principles could be recovered and adapted to contemporary needs. The dome's visual impact, its perfect proportions, its elegant silhouette, its seeming defiance of gravitational forces announced that human creativity could rival the achievements of antiquity. The artistic innovations of the early Renaissance were equally revolutionary. Masaccios frescoes in the Brancacci Chapel demonstrated that painting could achieve effects previously thought possible only in sculpture. His use of linear perspective, atmospheric modeling, and classical architectural settings created the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces. The emotional intensity of his figures, the grief of Adam and Eve expelled from Eden, the dignity of St. Peter healing the sick, invested religious subjects with psychological complexity that had been largely absent from medieval art. Donatello's sculptures pushed these innovations even further. His bronze David, completed around 1440, was the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, representing the human body not as a source of shame but as an object of beauty worthy of artistic celebration. His equestrian monument to the Condottiere Gattamelata in Padua revived the classical tradition of heroic portraiture, while creating a new model for secular commemoration. These artistic achievements reflected broader changes in European society and values. The patronage that made Renaissance art possible came primarily from merchants, bankers, and secular rulers rather than the church, which had dominated medieval artistic production. The subjects that artists chose to represent increasingly included classical mythology, contemporary history, and idealized portraits of living individuals, rather than the exclusively religious themes that had characterized medieval art. The political implications of Renaissance culture were equally significant. The civic humanism that developed in the Italian republics created new theories of government based on classical models rather than medieval precedents. Thinkers like Leonardo Bruni and Coluccio Salutati argued that active participation in political life was not only compatible with virtue but necessary for human flourishing. This represented a fundamental challenge to medieval assumptions about the superiority of contemplative over active life. The revival of classical political theory had practical consequences throughout 15th century Europe. The monarchies that had emerged from the crisis of the 14th century increasingly justified their authority through appeals to Roman law and classical political philosophy rather than feudal custom or divine right. The professional bureaucracies that served these monarchies were often staffed by humanist-educated lawyers who brought classical learning to bear on contemporary administrative problems. France under Louis XI exemplified this transformation of royal government. The Spider King, as his enemies called him, combined ruthless political calculation with systematic administrative innovation to create the most efficient monarchy in Europe. His destruction of the feudal autonomy that had survived the 100 Years' War was accomplished not through military conquest but through legal and financial pressure applied by professional administrators who owed their positions entirely to royal favor. The expansion of royal authority that Louis accomplished was typical of developments throughout Western Europe. In England, the Wars of the Roses had eliminated most of the great feudal houses, enabling the Tudor dynasty to establish monarchical authority more completely than any previous English rulers. In Spain, the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile created the foundation for unified Spanish monarchy, while their conquest of Granada in 1492 completed the Reconquista that had been in progress for 7 centuries. These stronger monarchies possessed both the motivation and the capability for territorial expansion on an unprecedented scale. The voyages of exploration that began in the 15th century represented the projection of European power beyond its traditional boundaries for the first time since the Crusades. The Portuguese expeditions down the African coast, culminating in Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498, established direct maritime connections between Europe and Asia that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled land routes. Columbus's westward voyage in 1492, sponsored by the Spanish crown, inadvertently initiated European contact with the Americas. The implications of these discoveries were profound and would not be fully apparent for centuries. The influx of American silver would fuel inflation that would transform European economic relationships. The establishment of overseas empires would make European powers global rather than merely regional forces. The encounter with non-European civilizations would challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature and cultural development. Yet, in 1500, these implications remained largely invisible. What was apparent was that European civilization had developed technologies, institutions, and intellectual frameworks that enabled it to project power across unprecedented distances. The navigational techniques developed by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, the artillery that made European armies superior to any non-European forces they encountered, the administrative systems that enabled small European populations to govern vast overseas territories. All of these represented the practical application of Renaissance innovations to the problems of expansion and conquest. The religious developments of the 15th century were equally significant for Europe's future. The conciliar movement that had emerged from the Great Schism had been defeated institutionally, but its underlying principles that religious authority should be accountable to the community of believers, that institutional reform was necessary for spiritual health, had not been forgotten. The devotional movements that flourished throughout Northern Europe emphasized personal piety and direct relationship with God in ways that implicitly challenged ecclesiastical mediation. The Brethren of the Common Life in the Netherlands created communities devoted to practical Christianity that bypassed traditional monastic vows while maintaining religious discipline. The devotional movement that they represented emphasized imitation of Christ's life rather than scholastic understanding of theological doctrine. The schools they established throughout Northern Europe educated generations of future reformers, including Erasmus of Rotterdam, who would bring humanist scholarship to bear on biblical and patristic texts. Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ, written around 1418, became one of the most widely read religious works in European history. Its emphasis on interior spirituality rather than external observances, its suspicion of worldly learning, its focus on personal transformation rather than institutional reform, all of these themes would become central to the Protestant Reformation of the following century. The humanist movement that had begun in Italy was simultaneously transforming biblical scholarship in ways that would have profound theological implications. Lorenzo Valla's demonstration that the donation of Constantine was a medieval forgery challenged papal claims to temporal authority based on supposed imperial grants. His linguistic analysis of the Vulgate Bible revealed numerous translation errors that called into question the textual foundations of medieval theology. Johannes Reuchlin's Hebrew studies in Germany and Guillaume Boudet's Greek scholarship in France represented the extension of humanist philological methods to biblical texts. The Complutensian Polyglot Bible, published in Spain between 1514 and 1517, provided parallel texts in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin that enabled scholars to compare different versions and identify textual variations that had accumulated over centuries of manuscript transmission. These scholarly developments were creating the intellectual foundations for religious reform, but in 1500, few observers expected that challenge to come through popular rebellion rather than scholarly consensus. The institutional church had recovered much of its prestige and authority following the resolution of the Great Schism. The Renaissance popes, particularly Sixtus IV and Julius II, had restored papal prestige through magnificent artistic patronage and successful territorial expansion in central Italy. Yet this apparent institutional health concealed spiritual problems that would soon explode into the Protestant Reformation. The worldliness that characterized the Renaissance papacy scandalized many Christians who expected spiritual leadership from their ecclesiastical superiors. The financial innovations that the Church had developed to fund artistic projects and territorial expansion, particularly the sale of indulgences, seemed to reduce salvation to a commercial transaction. And most importantly, the printing press was making religious knowledge accessible to lay Christians who could read vernacular translations of biblical and devotional texts without clerical mediation. The same technological innovation that was spreading Renaissance culture throughout Europe was also creating the conditions for a religious revolution by democratizing access to the Christian faith. As the 15th century ended, European civilization stood at a crossroads that no contemporary observer could have fully appreciated. The medieval world that had been created through the synthesis of classical, Germanic, and Christian traditions was clearly ending. The Renaissance culture that was replacing it emphasized human dignity, individual achievement, and creative innovation in ways that would have seemed blasphemous to medieval theologians. The political innovations of the late medieval period had created stronger, more efficient governments capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources for war and exploration. The technological developments of the Renaissance, particularly printing, improved artillery, and advanced navigation, had given Europeans decisive advantages over non-European civilizations. The religious movements of the 15th century had prepared the ground for theological challenges that would shatter the unity of Western Christianity. The Europe of 1500 was wealthier, more powerful, and more sophisticated than the Europe of 1000, but it was also more divided and potentially more explosive. The strength in monarchies that had emerged from medieval fragmentation possessed both the motivation and the capability for conflicts that would dwarf the localized violence of feudal society. The religious tensions that had been contained within medieval Christendom would soon explode into wars that would devastate the continent for over a century. Yet the achievements were undeniable. The artistic masterpieces of the Renaissance, the philosophical insights of humanist scholars, the technological innovations that would enable global exploration, the institutional developments that would provide the foundation for modern government. All of these represented the culmination of medieval Europe's thousand-year evolution from the ruins of Rome. As Columbus returned from his first voyage to the Americas in 1493, as Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498, as Leonardo da Vinci filled his notebooks with designs for flying machines and military engines, medieval Europe was transforming itself into something entirely new, the civilization that would dominate the world for the next 4 centuries. The medieval age was ending not with collapse but with transformation, not with failure but with unprecedented success. The Europe that entered the 16th century bore the genetic code of its medieval predecessor but was evolving into something that would have astonished Charlemagne, amazed Thomas Aquinas, and perhaps horrified the authors of those chronicles who had recorded the simple faith and violent certainties of an age that was passing forever into history. The thousand-year story of medieval Europe was complete. The modern world was about to begin.